Hey everyone, tonight we're starting a trip into the dark parts of history that will change how you see the medieval times. Picture living in an age when the church didn't just tell you what to do on Sundays. They also controlled what you did. In your bedroom, every kiss, every touch, every private moment between a husband and wife was closely watched, ruled over, and often punished by men in robes who had promised never to feel love themselves. Tonight, we're showing you the weirdest, most shocking, and sometimes saddest rules about sex from the medieval era. Trust me, by the time this series is over, you'll see that Game of Thrones had nothing on real medieval life. Now, before we get into these amazing stories together, I'd like you to join our group. If you're someone who wants to hear real history, told in a way that actually keeps you interested, or in this case, helps you gently fall asleep, then please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. I'm also really curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you warm? In bed? Maybe scrolling on your phone one last time? Or maybe you're somewhere totally different? Leave a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your stories often give me ideas for my next deep look into history. So, lower those lights, get comfortable. Maybe turn on a gentle fan for that perfect background noise, and let's go back almost 1,000 years to find out how the most private parts of human life were shaped by forces we can hardly imagine. Picture this. It's the year 1215, and you're a newly married couple in medieval England. You've just said your vows in front of your whole village, and now you're finally alone on your wedding night. But here's the twist that would scare any modern couple. You're not actually alone. Standing outside your bedroom door are men from the local church, waiting to check the sheets the next morning for proof that you've completed your marriage in the right way. And by the right way, I mean following a strict set of rules that decided everything from the position you used to the day of the week you chose to be close. This wasn't some strange thing happening in a faraway village. This was the truth across Christian Europe for nearly 600 years. The Catholic Church had created what experts now call the most complete system of sexual control ever put into place in human history. They didn't just offer ideas. They made laws, enforced punishments, and built a whole system around controlling what happened between married couples in their own homes. Let me tell you the story of Agnes and William, a real couple from 14th century France, whose marriage record is still in the Vatican files. Agnes was 17, William was 22. And they thought their biggest problem would be learning to run William's family farm together. They had no idea that the church had already decided that they were not allowed to be close for more than 200 days each year. You see, the medieval church had made what they called the calendar of not being intimate. Thursdays were not allowed because that's when Christ was arrested. Fridays were out because of the crucifixion. Saturdays honored the Virgin Mary, so absolutely no closeness was allowed. Sundays were the Lord's Day, totally off limits. That left only Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday for married couples to show their love physically. But hold on, there's more. The whole seasons of Lent and Advent were also forbidden times. Add in these special days for major saints, and you have a married couple being allowed to be close for maybe 120 days out of the whole year. Agnes and William tried to follow these rules. The church records show that Agnes went to confession often, sometimes saying that she and her husband had sinned by being close on a forbidden day. The priest would give them a task as punishment, sometimes making them sleep in separate beds for weeks, or go without food, or even make costly donations to the church. For a farming family, these donations could be the difference between getting through a hard winter and going hungry. But here's what makes this story both sad and strangely uplifting. Agnes and William found ways to connect that had nothing to do with being physically close. The same church records that show their sexual sins also show a couple who wrote letters to each other when William went to nearby towns, who shared dreams about their future children, and who helped each other through times when crops failed and family members died. The church's effort to control their bodies actually pushed them to build a deeper, more emotional bond. The church's hold on medieval sex went far beyond just calendars and timing. They literally had spies in every community, not secret agents, but regular churchgoers who were encouraged to report on their neighbors' actions. If a couple was heard laughing too loudly from their bedroom, if they seemed too loving in public, or if a wife seemed too eager for her husband's attention, it could lead to them being called to see the local bishop. Take the case of Margaret, the baker from Canterbury, England in 1346. Her own neighbor reported her to church leaders for the crime of being too happy in her marriage. The neighbor said that Margaret hummed while doing her housework, smiled too often when her husband came home from work, and this was seen as especially bad proof was seen kissing her husband goodbye in their doorway where others could see. Margaret was made to do a public punishment, standing in front of the church every Sunday for a month, while the other churchgoers were told that her actions were setting a bad example for other wives. The mental effect of this control was terrible. Imagine growing up in a world where you're taught that the most natural human feelings and wants are wrong, where showing love for your spouse to openly brand you as a bad person, where your most private moments are watched by the community and judged by the church. But maybe the strangest part of the church's sexual control was their detailed instruction books for married couples. Yes, you heard that right. The medieval church made actual guidebooks for how married couples should handle their private lives. These books, written by celibate priests who had never been married themselves, had specific instructions about which positions were allowed, how long it should last, and even the thoughts couples were allowed to have while being close. The most famous of these guides was written by a French monk named Brother Thomas in 1277. In his book, he explains that couples must stay totally silent while being close, must think only of having children, and must immediately pray for forgiveness afterward. He actually suggests that couples should approach their marriage bed with the same serious mood they would bring to a funeral. The book was copied by hand and passed out to churches across Europe, becoming the unofficial rulebook for Christian marriage for more than 200 years. What's amazing is how couples found quiet ways to fight back against these rules. Findings from old medieval homes show that rich families started building their bedrooms farther from the main living spaces, with thicker walls and several doors, creating privacy that would make it harder for neighbors to watch their activities. Love letters from that time, written in a secret code that seems to be about farming or business, actually have deeply loving words that would have shocked church leaders if they had been written plainly. The money-related effect of the church's sexual control was huge too. Rich families paid large amounts of money to the church for special permission, basically buying the right to break the sexual rules when it was good for them. A merchant might pay for the right to complete his marriage during Lent if that timing was better for his business trips. This created a two-level system where the rich could literally buy their way out of sexual rules, while poor families like Agnes and William had no choice but to follow every rule or face harsh results. And here's something that will amaze you. The church's control over sex actually shaped how European languages grew. Many of the words we use today for close relationships, for parts of the human body, and even for feelings like love and desire, carry the marks of medieval shame and control. The word passion, which we now use in a good way to describe strong love, originally meant suffering in medieval Latin because the church taught that all strong feelings, including love, were a kind of spiritual suffering that moved you farther from God. As we end this first part of our journey through medieval sex, think about Agnes and William trying to build a loving marriage while dealing with a system made to make them feel ashamed of their most natural human connections. Their story isn't just ancient history, it's the base that shaped how the West saw sex for centuries to come. Many of the sexual nonas, the shame, and the complex link between love and religion that still affect our culture today can be traced right back to these medieval church rules. But Agnes and William's story had a surprising turn that shows something beautiful about how strong people are. In 1348, when the Black Death Plague came to their village and the church's usual powers started to fall apart, their love letters show a couple who had learned to find joy and connection despite all the rules put on them. They had found that real closeness couldn't be controlled by any group. It could only be made by two people choosing to trust and care for each other day after day, no matter what the world outside told them to do. Coming up next, we're going to look into something that might make you thankful for even the most awkward. Modern wedding experiences. The strange wedding night rituals that whole medieval communities not only watched, but were actively part of. We'll meet couples who had to prove their love in front of crowds and find out why some medieval wedding nights ended not in romance, but in public shame and even tragedy. The story of what happened to Lady Eleonora of Aquitaine on her wedding night in 1189 will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval romance. Now, if you thought the church's bedroom watching was nosy, wait until you hear about what happened on medieval wedding nights. Because in the Middle Ages, your most private moment as a newly married couple wasn't private at all. It was quite literally a community event with an audience, official witnesses, and what can only be called the world's most awkward performance review. Let me tell you about Lady Eleonora of Aquitaine. Not the famous queen, but a less-known noblewoman whose wedding night in 1189 was so upsetting that it's still written about in 3 different monastery records. Eleonora was 16, marrying Lord Geoffrey of Normandy in what was seen as a high-status political match. She had spent months getting ready for this moment, learning from her mother and aunts about what to expect. But nothing could have prepared her for what really happened. The bedding ceremony started right after the wedding dinner. This wasn't some cute tradition where guests just walked the couple to their room. No. This was a fancy ritual that treated the bride and groom like prize animals being readied for breeding. First, the wedding party, sometimes more than 50 people, would physically carry the couple to the bedroom. The bride would be on one side of the room, the groom on the other. And then the real show would start. The women of the wedding party would take off all the bride's clothes while singing traditional songs that were basically medieval versions of locker room chants. At the same time, the men would do the same to the groom, often making jokes and comments about his physical readiness for the job ahead. Can you imagine standing naked in front of your new in-laws, your parents, your brothers and sisters, and half the important people of the area while they argue about if you're good enough for marriage? But it gets worse. Once both bride and groom were undressed, the priest would bless the marriage bed while the couple stood there completely bare. Then, and this is where Eleonora's story becomes especially sad, the witnesses would actually watch the couple get into bed together. Some areas required the couple to kiss in front of the crowd. Others demanded that the groom show his, let's call it, his eagerness for the marriage. Eleonora's records show that she fainted during this process. Not from excitement or nervousness, but from pure shame and terror. When she collapsed, the wedding party argued about whether this was a sign that she was unfit for marriage, or if they should just wait for her to get better and continue the ceremony. They chose to wait. She was woken up with cold water and wine, and the bedding ceremony went on. Now, here's the part that will make your skin crawl. After the couple was finally left alone, the real reason for this whole show came out. The next morning, people from both families would check the bedsheets for proof that the marriage had been completed and that the bride had been a virgin. This wasn't just a formality, it was a legal rule. Without this proof, the marriage could be declared invalid, the dowry could be returned, and the bride could be sent back to her family in disgrace. The pressure on these young women was beyond imagination. In Eleonora's case, she and Geoffrey were both so hurt by the public shame that they couldn't complete their marriage that first night. When the families found unstained sheets the next morning, Eleonora was accused of either not being a virgin or of refusing to do her wifely duties. Geoffrey, at the same time, was made fun of by the men for his inability to claim his prize. But here's where Eleonora's story becomes both tragic and strangely inspiring. The records show that she and Geoffrey spent that first night not in passionate romance, but in quiet talk about their shared painful experience. They found that they were both scared, both shamed, and both desperately wanted to escape the expectations put on them. This shared weakness actually became the start of real fondness between them. They had to fake the proof of completion. Geoffrey cut his finger with his knife and stained the sheets with his blood, while Eleonora practiced acting the part of a happy new wife. When the families came back the next morning, they accepted the fake proof and the performance, and the marriage was declared valid. The bloody sheet tradition was so key to medieval marriage that rich families actually kept these stained cloths as family treasures. The Paston family of Yorkshire, England, showed their collection of virtue cloths in their great hall for over 2 centuries. Guests would be shown these sheets as proof of the family's honorable family line and the purity of their women. Imagine bringing a date home and having your parents show them your great-great-grandmother's bed sheets from her wedding night. But the real tragedy wasn't just the shame. 'Twas what happened to young women who couldn't produce the expected proof. Historical records from Canterbury Cathedral show dozens of cases of marriages being cancelled because of not enough proof of completion. These women were often sent to convents, not because they felt a religious calling, but because they had become unmarriageable. Their lives were basically over before they had really started. Take the case of Isabel de Clare from 1203. Her wedding night bedding ceremony went as planned. But when morning came, there was no blood on the sheets. Isabel insisted that she had been a virgin and that the marriage had been completed. But without the physical proof, her husband's family declared the marriage invalid. Isabel was 23 years old, seen as almost old for a first marriage, and no other family would think of taking her as a bride. Here's what makes Isabel's story especially heartbreaking. Modern medical knowledge tells us that not all women bleed during their first sexual experience. Things like physical activity, health conditions, or just individual body differences can mean that a perfectly pure bride might not produce the proof that medieval society demanded. But in 1203, this scientific understanding didn't exist. Isabel's life was ruined by a lack of biological knowledge disguised as moral truth. The mental effect of these bedding ceremonies went far beyond the wedding night itself. Young women would spend months before their marriages in a state of fear. Not about marriage itself, but about this public test they would have to go through. Some actually hurt themselves beforehand to make sure they would bleed on cue. Others made secret plans with servants to get animal blood if needed. One of the strangest documented cases comes from the court records of King Philip, Augustus of France, in 1198. A bride named Marguerite had been so scared of her upcoming bedding ceremony that she convinced her younger sister to take her place in the marriage bed, hiding in darkness while the sister completed the marriage with Marguerite's husband. The lie was only found weeks later when the sister became pregnant and confessed to the local priest. The scandal destroyed both families and led to new laws requiring bride identification during bedding ceremonies. But maybe the most shocking part of these rituals was how they affected the men as well. Grooms were expected to perform sexually in front of an audience, often while nervous, drunk from the wedding feast, and dealing with their own pain from the public undressing. Historical accounts describe young men who simply couldn't function under such conditions, leading to accusations of being unable to perform, witchcraft, or being gay, any of which could result in the marriage being canceled, and the man's reputation being destroyed. The money-related outcomes were huge too. When a bedding ceremony failed, both families lost big investments. The bride's dowry would usually be returned, but the groom's family had already paid for the wedding feast, the ceremony, and often gave the bride expensive gifts. Legal fights over failed bedding ceremonies could go on for years and bankrupt whole families. Some areas created complex workarounds for these problems. In parts of Germany, professional bedding witnesses could be hired. Women whose job was to confirm virginity and completion without needing the full public ceremony. These women, often midwives or older widows, would examine the bride privately and then give sworn statements about her condition. It was still shameful. But at least it wasn't a community play. The most forward-thinking regions began allowing couples to give written statements instead of physical proof, though this was often viewed with doubt. Some noble families actually hired artists to create detailed records of the bedding ceremony, complete with drawings that would make a modern person blush. These marriage verification books were kept in family files and could be shown as proof. In legal fights years later, what's remarkable is how some couples found ways to take back their power within this harsh system. Eleonora and Jeffrey, whose story we started with, eventually created a code system where they would signal to each other during public events, giving emotional support and standing together against constant watching. Their marriage, which began in pain and lies, grew into what the records describe as one of the most truly loving partnerships of their time. The bedding ceremony tradition began to fade in the late 14th century, partly due to changing ideas about privacy, but mostly because of the Black Death, when half the people were dying of plague. People became less concerned with fancy wedding rituals and more focused on simply staying alive long enough to have children. The closeness that had been treated as a public item suddenly became precious and private again. Coming up next, we're diving into something that will make you appreciate modern marriage counseling: the confession booth questionings. We're medieval. Priests demanded clear details about every part of married couples' private lives. We'll find out how the church created a classification system for sexual sins that was more detailed than modern tax laws. And meet Father Benedict of Tours, whose confession records show the shocking reality of how ordinary people tried to navigate impossible moral rules while keeping their sanity and their marriages. The candlelight flickered in the small wooden booth as Father Benedict of Tours got ready for what would be the most awkward talk of his week. It was Tuesday morning in 1274, and sitting across from him was Marie, a baker's wife who had come for her monthly confession. What happened next shows just how deeply the medieval church had pushed itself into the most private parts of married life. You see, medieval confession wasn't the short, general admission of doing wrong that many people think of today. It was a questioning. Priests carried detailed handbooks called penitentials that had specific questions they had to ask about sexual behavior. Father Benedict's handbook, which luckily survived in the files of Tours Cathedral, has over 300 questions just about marital closeness. 300. Let that sink in for a moment. The questioning would start simply enough. Have you been true to your husband this month? But then it would move into areas that would make a modern therapist blush. Father Benedict was required to ask about positions used during closeness, how often they had relations, whether Marie felt pleasure, and whether she had done any acts that the church thought were unnatural, which included basically anything beyond the most basic baby-making activities. Marie's confession, written down in Father Benedict's own handwriting, shows the mental pain these sessions caused. She admitted to having impure thoughts about her husband during the day while working in the bakery. She confessed to enjoying physical affection, which the church classified as the sin of luxuria, or too much pleasure in marital duties. Most sadly, she revealed that she and her husband had been close on a Friday evening, which meant she had to perform a punishment for 30 days. But here's where the story becomes really troubling. Father Benedict's records show that he kept detailed notes about every couple in his parish. He knew which wives were too eager for their husband's attention, which husbands were doing their duties with the right frequency, and which couples were breaking the endless calendar of forbidden days. This wasn't pastoral care, it was spying. The Church had created what can only be called a sexual sorting system that would make modern systems look simple. They had categories for dozens of different types of sexual sins, each with its own specific punishment. Malice was the sin of enjoying marital relations too much. Sodomia covered any position other than what they called natural meaning. The man on top, both partners clothed, with very little movement. Fornicatio matrimonialis was the crime of married couples acting too much like lovers instead of business partners in having children. Father Benedict's most shocking case involved a couple named Thomas and Beatrice, who had been married for 7 years and had 4 children. During confession, Beatrice admitted that she and Thomas sometimes laughed together during private moments. She described how they would whisper jokes to each other, how Thomas would make her smile, and how their physical relationship had become a source of joy in their hard lives. Father Benedict was shocked. According to his training, marital closeness should be approached with the same seriousness as a funeral. Laughter during such moments was proof of treating a holy baby-making duty as fun. He gave Beatrice a punishment. That included sleeping in separate beds for 2 months, not eating every Friday for a year, and making a long walk to a holy site 50 miles away for the crime of enjoying her marriage. The financial effect of these punishments was terrible for working families. When Father Benedict sentenced a blacksmith named Robert to donate a month's pay to the Church for the sin of too much marital affection, Robert's family nearly starved that winter. The church records show that Robert had confessed to kissing his wife too often and to thinking lustful thoughts about her while she worked in their garden. But the psychological harm went even deeper than the money troubles. The confession handbooks required priests to ask questions that forced people to break down and label their most private moments in terms of sin and purity. Couples began to doubt every touch, every look, every moment of connection. Father Benedict's records are full of confessions from people who had become scared of their own natural feelings. One of the most heartbreaking entries in Father Benedict's confession log comes from a woman named Catherine, who had been married for just 3 months. She confessed that she had started to fear her husband's touch because she was afraid of feeling pleasure, which would mean another confession and another punishment. She described lying in bed at night, trying to figure out if showing love to her husband would result in sins that her family couldn't afford to pay the punishment for. The Church's sexual questioning system created a whole hidden economy of lies and tricks. Father Benedict's own notes show his doubts that many couples were being honest in confession. Some had clearly practiced their answers to avoid the worst punishments. Others created complex stand-in words and secret language to describe their private lives in ways that might get past the priest's notice. The smartest resistance came from a merchant's wife named Isabel, whose confessions Father Benedict wrote down for over 15 years. Reading between the lines of his notes, it becomes clear that Isabel had figured out exactly which sins had the lightest punishments and would confess to those small wrongs while leaving out anything that might result in serious punishment. She basically played the system, protecting her marriage while keeping up the look of following religious rules. But not everyone was so smart. Father Benedict's records also show the complete collapse of several marriages under the pressure of constant sexual watching. One couple, John and Alice, stopped having private relations completely after repeated harsh punishments. Their marriage became so cold and far apart that Alice eventually left to join a convent. Not because of a religious calling, but as an escape from a relationship that had been destroyed by the Church's meddling. The priests themselves were often uncomfortable with this role as sexual investigators. Father Benedict's personal writings, found in his private journal, show a man struggling with the clash between his promise of celibacy and his detailed knowledge of marital closeness. He wrote about feeling like a spy, about the absurdity of advising couples on things he'd sworn never to experience, and about his growing doubts about whether God really cared about the specific details of how married people showed their love. Some priests found creative ways to undermine the system from the inside. Father Benedict began to give lighter and lighter punishments over time, and his later records show him accepting vague confessions that would have required intense questioning. In his earlier years, he developed a kind of code with his regular churchgoers, letting them confess to general marital impurity without giving the clear details that the church handbooks demanded. The most revealing document in Father Benedict's file is a letter he wrote to his bishop in 1282, near the end of his career. In it, he questions whether the church's sexual watching was actually hurting the marriages it said it was protecting. He wrote, "I have seen more love destroyed by punishment than saved by purity." The bishop's reply was quick and harsh. Father Benedict was moved to a remote monastery where he spent his last years in forced silence. The confession system also created deep gender unfairness in how sexual morals were enforced. Father Benedict's records show that women were questioned more aggressively, given harsher punishments, and held responsible for their husband's sexual behavior. If a man confessed to too much lust, the priest would often give punishment to his wife as well, thinking that she must have tempted him into sin. This double standard hit its peak in the case of Eleonora, a nobleman's wife, who was given 6 months of separate sleeping arrangements because her husband had confessed to finding her too attractive. Eleonora hadn't confessed to any sexual scenes herself, but Father Benedict ruled that her beauty was a form of temptation that put her husband's soul in danger. She was required to wear plain clothes, not style her hair, and limit her talks with her husband to necessary household topics. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the confession system was how it affected children's understanding of love and marriage. Young people grew up hearing their parents talk about marital closeness only in terms of sin, punishment, and moral failure. Father Benedict's records include confessions from teenagers who were terrified of marriage because they connected physical affection with spiritual corruption. One especially tragic case involved a 16-year-old girl named Margot who begged Father Benedict to help her avoid an arranged marriage because she had heard so many confessions about marital sins that she believed physical closeness was not compatible with being saved. Father Benedict's notes show his struggle to explain that marital relations could be both sinful and necessary, a contradiction that he himself couldn't fully solve. The economic abuse built into the confession system becomes clear when you look at Father Benedict's financial records. The Church collected large fees for punishments, pardons, and special permissions related to sexual sins. A rich merchant could pay extra to confess to a higher-ranking priest who might give lighter punishments, while poor families had no choice but to accept whatever punishment their local priest gave. Coming up next, we're exploring something that makes medieval confession look tame by comparison: the bizarre and deadly world of medieval birth control. We'll meet couples who tried to prevent pregnancy using methods that were more likely to kill them than provide any protection, and discover how the Church's ban on birth control led to some of the most dangerous and desperate medical practices in human history. The story of Lady Margaret of Winchester and her tragic encounter with mercury. Birth control will show you just how far people were willing to go to control their own reproductive futures. Behind the stone walls of Winchester Castle in 1298, Lady Margaret was getting ready to risk her life in a way that would shock any modern woman. She wasn't facing an enemy army or a deadly disease. She was about to swallow a mix of mercury, lead, and crushed pearls because she believed it would prevent pregnancy. What happened to Lady Margaret over the next few weeks shows the desperate measures medieval women took to control their reproductive lives and the deadly results of living in a world where the Church had banned all forms of birth control. The Medieval way of handling birth control was a strange mix of old superstition, dangerous chemistry, and pure desperation. Since the Church had declared any try to prevent pregnancy a deadly sin, there were no real medical doctors offering safe choices. Instead, women depended on a secret network of herb specialists, wise women, and traveling sellers who sold cures that were often more poisonous than helpful. Lady Margaret had already had 6 children in 8 years of marriage. Her body was worn out, her health was bad, and her doctor had privately warned her that another pregnancy might kill her. But divorce wasn't a choice. Not having sex would. Need her husband's help, which she didn't have, and the Church offered no good alternatives. So, like thousands of medieval women, she turned to the black market of reproductive control. The recipe that Lady Margaret got came from a traveling seller who said it was used by the noble ladies of France. It required mercury dissolved in wine mixed with powdered lead, crushed pearls for cleaning, and herbs, including tansy and pennyroyal. She was told to drink this mix every morning for 7 days. Then, once a week after that, the seller promised her it would close the womb and prevent pregnancy while causing no harm to her health. What the seller didn't tell her, and probably didn't know himself, was that mercury is one of the most poisonous things known to humans. The lead would cause brain damage and organ failure. The herbs he recommended were things that cause abortion and could lead to heavy bleeding. And the pearls were not only useless, but could have been filled with bacteria that could cause deadly infections. Lady Margaret's personal letters, saved in the Winchester family files, document her slow poisoning in heartbreaking detail. Within days of starting the routine, she began to have shakes in her hands. She wrote to her sister that she felt as though my bones were made of water and that her teeth had started to loosen. By the 2nd week, her hair was falling out in clumps and she could barely hold a pen to write. But here's the truly tragic part. Lady Margaret kept taking the poison because she was so scared of another pregnancy. Our letters show a woman caught between 2 kinds of possible death: the mercury that was slowly killing her, or another childbirth that her weak body might not survive. She chose the mercury, and it killed her within 6 weeks. Lady Margaret's story wasn't rare. Medieval medical books that survived in monastery libraries show dozens of similar birth control recipes, each more dangerous than the last. One popular formula from 13th century Spain called for drinking a mix of copper sulfate and wine. Another widely used in England involved putting suppositories made from crocodile poop mixed with honey into the vagina. Yes, you heard that right. Crocodile poop. The thinking behind these cures shows a complete misunderstanding of human reproduction that would be funny if it weren't so deadly. Medieval doctors believed that pregnancy happened when hot and wet humors mixed in the womb. Therefore, they thought putting in cold and dry things would prevent pregnancy. Mercury was seen as extremely cold, which is why it showed up in so many birth control formulas, despite its clear poison. One of the most popular birth control methods was even weirder. Medieval women would wear charms containing what they believed were magical things. A surviving list from a 14th century English manor house lists charms containing the tooth of a child, the blood of a bat, and iron filings from a virgin's chastity belt that were worn around the waist to prevent pregnancy. The psychological effect might have been real, but the medical effectiveness was exactly zero. The Church's ban on birth control led to a whole hidden economy of reproductive control that worked outside any medical watch. In big cities like Paris and London, certain markets were known as places where women could quietly buy women's remedies. These sellers, often women themselves, sold everything from herbal teas to metal devices to magical charms, all promising to prevent or end unwanted pregnancies. One of the most successful of these secret practitioners was a woman known only as Dame Eleonora, who worked in London's Southwark area. From 1315 to 1347, Court records from her eventual trial show the size of her business. She had over 200 regular customers, including noblemen's wives, merchant women, and even the occasional nun. Her specialties included vaginal inserts made from lead and wool, potions containing antimony and sulfur, and what she called angel water, a mix that modern analysis suggests had high levels of arsenic. Dame Eleonora's customers weren't just trying to prevent pregnancy. Many were trying to end existing pregnancies. The line between birth control and abortion was blurry in medieval medicine, partly because pregnancy wasn't seen to start until quickening, when the mother could feel the baby move, usually around for months. This meant that anything done before quickening was technically birth control in medieval thinking. Even if it would be called abortion today, the most commonly used plant to cause abortion was called silphium, which was so popular for this reason that it was literally picked, until it was gone by the 14th century. Medieval women would travel hundreds of miles to get silphium seeds, which they would grind into powder and mix with wine. The plant was so valuable that it was worth more than its weight in gold, and its picture appeared on ancient Roman coins. When the last silphium plant died around 1340, medieval women lost their most trustworthy method of pregnancy control. With silphium gone, women turned to increasingly dangerous choices. Pennyroyal became the most common substitute, despite causing liver failure in high doses. Tansy was another popular choice, though it often caused violent seizures that could kill the mother along with ending the pregnancy. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye, was used despite causing gangrene that could require cutting off limbs. The desperation of medieval women led to physical methods that were even more dangerous than the chemical ones. Historical records describe women putting sharp objects into their wombs, drinking lye or other burning liquids, and deliberately causing harm to their stomachs by throwing themselves downstairs or having horses kick them in the belly. The rate of mothers dying from these tries was huge, but women kept trying because they saw no other options. One particularly well-documented case comes from the court records of Reginald de Grey, Sheriff of Nottingham. In 1354, a miller's wife named Joan had tried to end a pregnancy by putting a knitting needle into her womb. The procedure caused massive internal bleeding, and Joan died within hours. The case went to court not because of Joan's death, but because the church wanted to decide if she had committed suicide, a deadly sin that would have stopped her from being buried in holy ground. The money-related parts of medieval birth control show another layer of unfairness and abuse. Rich women like Lady Margaret could afford exotic and expensive ingredients, even if they were deadly. Poor women had to depend on whatever local plants they could find, often guided by folklore rather than any medical knowledge. This meant that rich women died from expensive poisons, while poor women died from whatever poisonous weeds they could find in the woods. Some medieval birth control methods seem almost modern in their approach, though they were still based on wrong understanding. Barrier methods existed. Medieval women used half lemons as cervical caps, put in wool soaked in various liquids, and even made simple diaphragms from animal bladders. These methods were probably the safest of all the medieval options, though their effectiveness was limited, and the church saw them as just as sinful as any other form of birth control. The psychological burden of this situation was huge. Medieval women lived in constant fear of pregnancy, knowing that each pregnancy might be their last. At the same time, they were taught that trying to prevent pregnancy was a sin that would doom their souls. Many developed what we would now see as severe anxiety disorders, constantly weighing the risk of pregnancy against the risk of birth control, against the risk of eternal punishment. Perhaps the most heartbreaking documents from this time are the confession records of women who had tried birth control or abortion. These women would confess not only their sin of trying to control their reproduction, but also their guilt over partners who had died. their relief at not being pregnant, and their terror of facing the same choice again. The Church's response was usually to give harsh punishments that often included public shame, turning these women's private medical decisions into community shame. Some brave doctors did try to offer safer options, though they had to be extremely careful about how they presented their advice. A medical text from 1287, written by a doctor known as Master Albert of Cologne, includes a section on keeping women's health that gives surprisingly correct information about timing pregnancy around menstrual cycles. He couldn't openly recommend this as birth control, so he framed it as advice for couples who wanted to make sure of the healthiest possible timing for pregnancy. The most tragic irony is that some medieval birth control methods actually worked. But women stopped using them because they weren't dramatic enough to seem effective. Extended breastfeeding, for example, does provide some natural birth spacing. But medieval women often stopped nursing early to try more aggressive birth control, methods that seemed more powerful but were actually deadly. Coming up next, we're diving into the medieval justice system's approach to adultery. And I promise you, it makes modern divorce court look like a friendly chat. We'll explore the public shame rituals that turn suspected adultery into community entertainment. Discover why a woman's accusation of adultery often said more about local politics than actual cheating. And meet Isabella de Furs, whose adultery trial in 1293 started a war between two English counties and changed the legal definition of marriage forever. The morning fog was still rising from the Thames when Isabella de Furs was dragged from her bed by armed guards in 1293. Her crime: she had been accused of adultery by her husband's political enemies. And what came next would start a war between two English counties and forever change how medieval society dealt with cheating in marriage. But Isabella's story is just the beginning of a justice system so brutal and strange that it makes modern divorce court look like gentle talks. Medieval adultery wasn't just about broken marriage promises. It was about property, politics, and power. When a woman was accused of adultery, she wasn't just facing personal shame. She was possibly making her children's inheritance rights invalid, destroying political connections, and giving her husband's enemies a weapon that could destroy entire family lines. The punishments weren't made to fix marriages. They were made to set examples that would scare anyone else thinking of stepping out of line. Isabella's case began not with proof of cheating, but with a fight over land. Her husband, John de Furs, controlled valuable lands in Yorkshire that his neighbor, Lord William de Mowbray, desperately wanted. When direct attacks on John's land claims failed, de Mowbray's agents began spreading rumors that Isabella had been seen in bad situations with a traveling merchant. In medieval law, if Isabella was proven guilty of adultery, her marriage could be cancelled, her children declared illegitimate, and her husband's property rights put in doubt. The accusations started a legal process that was part criminal trial, part public show, and part mental torture. Isabella was immediately put under house arrest while church and government leaders looked into the charges. But investigation in medieval times meant something very different from what we might expect today. There were no forensic experts, no private detectives, no careful checking of proof. Instead, the case would be decided by a mix of witness statements, character references, trial by ordeal, and if all else failed, trial by combat. The first part of Isabella's trial involved what was called purgation by oath. She had to find 12 oath helpers, people willing to swear on their own souls that they believed Isabella was innocent. This sounds easy until you realize that anyone who swore for Isabella and was later proven wrong would face charges of lying under oath and disrespecting God, possibly resulting in being kicked out of the church, having their property taken, or even death. Isabella's social connections had been carefully built over years of marriage and political ties. She had 12 women willing to swear for her innocence, but only if they could be sure that the political situation wouldn't turn. against them. As news spread about how serious the charges were and the powerful enemies against Isabella, her supporters began to back away one by one. They took back their promises to serve as oath helpers until Isabella was left with only 6 women willing to risk their lives for her reputation. With not enough oath helpers, Isabella's case moved to the next stage, trial by ordeal. The specific ordeal chosen for adultery cases was carrying a red-hot iron bar for 9 steps while saying the Lord's Prayer. If the accused woman's hands healed cleanly within 3 days, she was declared innocent. If the burns got infected or healed badly, she was guilty. Modern medical knowledge tells us that things like diet, general health, how clean the iron was, and simple luck decided the result. But medieval people saw the hand of God in every blister and scar. Isabella's trial by ordeal took place in the courtyard of York Minster on a cold November morning in 1293. The whole community had to attend, not just as witnesses, but as participants in what was seen as a divine judgment. The iron bar had been heated in the cathedral's altar fire for 3 hours until it glowed white-hot. Isabella, who had not eaten for 3 days as required by church law, was so weak she could barely stand. The court records kept in the York Minster archives describe what happened next in cold detail. Isabella took the iron bar in her bare hands and began walking. By the 3rd step, the smell of burning skin filled the courtyard. By the 6th step, Isabella was screaming in pain, but kept walking because dropping the iron would be an automatic admission of guilt. She finished the 9 steps and said the prayer, then collapsed as the iron was pulled from her burned hands. For 3 days, Isabella lay with a fever, while the whole community waited to see how her hands would heal. Her fate depended not on proof or testimony, but on whether her burns would get infected. The political stakes were huge. If Isabella was declared guilty, it would support Lord de Mowbray's claims and possibly change the map of Yorkshire land ownership. On the 3rd day, Isabella's hands showed signs of clean healing. She was declared innocent by divine judgment, and the adultery charges were dropped. But the story doesn't end there. Because Lord de Mowbray refused to accept the result, he claimed that Isabella had somehow cheated the ordeal, maybe by treating her hands with protective things or bribing the church officials watching the trial. This accusation led to something that had never happened before in medieval English law: a trial by combat to decide the truth of a trial by ordeal. Lord de Mowbray challenged John de Furs to a personal fight, claiming that Isabella's innocence could only be proven if her husband was willing to risk his life defending her honor. If John won the fight, Isabella's innocence would be confirmed. If he lost, she would be declared guilty after death, and their children would lose their inheritance rights. The fight took place at Stamford Bridge. Yes, the same place where Harold Godwinson had beaten the Vikings just over 2 centuries earlier. The weapons were swords and shields. The armor was chainmail, and the fight was to the death. John de Furs, who was 47 years old and hadn't been in a real fight for over a decade, faced William de Mowbray, who was 31 and seen as one of the best knights in northern England. But here's where Isabella's story takes a surprising turn that shows the complex political reasons behind medieval adultery accusations. The night before the fight, Isabella's brother arrived from Scotland with a small army, claiming that an attack on his sister's honor was an attack on Scottish independence itself. Suddenly, what had started as a marriage fight had grown into an international event threatening to restart the wars between England and Scotland. King Edward I, who had bigger worries than a Yorkshire land fight, stepped in personally. He declared that both the adultery charges and the trial by combat were invalid, gave a huge fine to Lord de Mowbray for making false accusations, and required him to do public penance by walking barefoot to Isabella's manor and begging her forgiveness in front of the whole community. Isabella's case sets several important legal examples that changed how adultery accusations were handled throughout medieval Europe. First, it showed that trial by ordeal results could be challenged if there was proof of political reasons behind the original accusations. Second, it created the rule that adultery charges affecting inheritance rights needed higher levels of proof than simple marriage fights. Third, and most importantly, it recognized that women accused of adultery had the right to question the motives of their accusers. But Isabella's experience was quite lucky compared to what happened to ordinary women accused of adultery without powerful family connections, political friends, or the money to survive a trial by ordeal. Most women faced punishments that were designed more for public shame than divine justice. The most common punishment for convicted adulteresses was carding, being stripped to their underclothes, placed in a wooden cart, and paraded through every street in the community while citizens threw rotten food, human waste, and stones. The woman would be forced to confess her sins out loud at every major street corner, describing her cheating in clear detail while the crowd jeered and cursed. One particularly well-documented carding took place in Canterbury in 1284, involving a baker's wife named Alice, who had been found guilty of adultery with a traveling wool merchant. The court records describe how Alice was forced to wear a pointed paper hat labeled "Adulteress" in large letters, while town criers announced her crimes before her cart reached each new street. The carding lasted 6 hours, during which Alice was pelted with filth until she was unrecognizable. But the shame didn't end with the carding. Alice was then put through the cucking stool, a chair tied to a long wooden beam that would dunk the victim repeatedly into the nearest river or pond. The number of dunks was decided by how serious the adultery was. Alice, whose affair had supposedly lasted 3 months, received 30 dunks. By the 25th dunking, she had passed out. She drowned during the 29th dip, turning her public shame into an accidental execution. The psychological effect of these punishments went far beyond the convicted women themselves. Whole communities were forced to take part in the shame rituals, creating a culture where neighbors were encouraged to spy on each other, where any woman who seemed too friendly with men faced doubt, and where marriages became shows of goodness, designed to avoid community watching. Medieval adultery law also created a gender double standard that was so extreme it was almost ridiculous. A man could have multiple sexual relationships outside marriage with few legal consequences, but a woman could be executed for a single kiss with someone other than her husband. The reason was purely about money. A woman's adultery could result in another man's children inheriting her husband's property, while a man's adultery created no such inheritance problems. This double standard reached its peak in the case of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, whose 1312 trial records show a man who openly kept 3 separate households with different women, had children with at least 7 different partners, and bragged about his sexual wins during church services. When his wife, Lady Catherine, was seen talking privately with her childhood friend, a conversation that lasted maybe 10 minutes, she was immediately accused of adultery and put through a trial by ordeal, the strangest part of medieval adultery. Punishment was the idea of symbolic execution for women whose actual execution would create political problems. Noblewomen or those with powerful family connections might be put through rituals that copied execution without actually killing them. Lady Catherine de Montfort was forced to lie in a coffin for 3 days while a funeral service was said over her, symbolically dying for her adultery while staying technically alive. Coming up next, we're entering the shady world of medieval clergy who preached about being celibate by day while living secret lives that would make modern gossip papers look tame. We'll meet Pope Alexander VI, whose wild parties were so famous that they inspired new Latin words for wild living, and discover how the very group that controlled everyone else's sex lives became the most sexually corrupt group in medieval Europe. The hypocrisy was so extreme that it eventually started religious wars that changed the entire continent. The Golden Cup shook in Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia's hands as he led Mass at St. Peter's Basilica in 1492. But it wasn't from religious feeling. It was from the hangover he got at the previous night's wild party in his private papal rooms. Within months, this same man would become Pope Alexander VI, and his rule would turn the Vatican into what shocked onlookers called the brothel of Rome. The hypocrisy was so stunning that it makes modern political scandals look like small mistakes. You see, while the Church was busy controlling every part of ordinary people's private lives, questioning married couples about their bedroom activities, and executing women for adultery, the very men making these rules were living in a state of sexual overindulgence that would have impressed Roman emperors. The medieval Catholic Church didn't just have a few bad apples. It had created a whole separate culture where vows of celibacy were treated as mere suggestions and sexual hunger was seen as a sign of power rather than sin. Pope Alexander VI's story begins long before he took the papal throne.
Cardinal Borgia.
He had already fathered at least 7 children with 4 different women, kept multiple mistresses at the same time, and was famous throughout Rome for hosting dinner parties where clergy and prostitutes mixed freely in what can only be called religious-themed adult entertainment. His peers wrote detailed accounts of these gatherings, and their descriptions would make a modern adult film director blush. One particularly well-documented evening in 1490. Described in the diary of Papal Master of Ceremonies Johann Burchard, featured what Borgia called a theological discussion that actually involved 50 prostitutes dancing naked around a papal altar while cardinals and bishops placed bets on which women could pick up chestnuts scattered on the floor using only their mouths. The winner would get silk stockings and jewelry provided by the cardinal himself. Burchard wrote that he had never seen such wildness in the house of God and worried that Satan himself had moved into the Vatican. But Rodrigo Borgia was far from the only one. The corruption of medieval clergy was so organized and common that whole monasteries worked more like exclusive men's clubs with religious themes than actual religious places. The monastery of St. Denis, near Paris, which was supposed to house celibate monks devoted to prayer and thought, was revealed in a 1248 papal investigation to be running a complex prostitution ring that served wealthy Parisian merchants. The investigation records, kept in the Vatican's secret archives, show an operation that would impress modern organized crime groups. The monks had turned the monastery's wine cellars into private rooms where spiritual counseling sessions took place between monks and carefully chosen women from the nearby countryside. The donations for these sessions were large enough to make St. Denis one of the wealthiest religious places in France. When church investigators finally raided the place, they found account books listing over 200 regular clients and a price list that changed based on the spiritual services requested. The psychological effect of this hypocrisy on ordinary believers was terrible. Imagine being a medieval peasant who was forced to confess your most private thoughts to a priest, paying harsh punishments for natural human wants, while knowing that the same priest was living a life of sexual excess that made your sins look like small mistakes. Historical records from the time show a dramatic rise in religious doubt and the first signs of what would eventually become the Protestant Reformation. One of the most shocking examples of clerical sexual corruption involved Pope John XII, who ruled from 955 to 964 and turned the Lateran Palace into what historians gently call a house of ill repute. Contemporary accounts describe John XII ordaining deacons in horse stables while drunk, having sexual relations on the papal altar, and calling on pagan gods during Christian ceremonies while surrounded by prostitutes dressed as nuns. The situation became so scandalous that the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I personally traveled to Rome to investigate. What he found was a pope who had turned the most holy spaces of Christianity into places for wild parties that mixed religious ritual with sexual performance art. Otto's report, kept in the Chronicles of the Monastery of Corvey, describes walking into St. John Lateran to find Pope John engaging in intimate acts with a woman while wearing full papal robes, including the papal tiara. But perhaps the most disturbing part of medieval clerical sexuality was how it created secret networks that worked across international borders. Bishops and abbots would trade information about available women, share resources for their sexual businesses, and even loan each other their favorite mistresses for special occasions. The letters between Bishop Guillaume of Paris and Abbot Pierre of Cluny, found in 1998 during restoration work at Notre Dame, show a relationship that sounds more like modern sex trafficking than medieval religious leadership. In one particularly chilling letter from 1267, Bishop Guillaume writes to Abbot Pierre about sending 3 young novices from our convent to assist with your Easter celebrations, using language that makes it clear these women were being treated as sexual items rather than religious followers. The logistics described in their letters, safe houses, payment schedules, and methods for avoiding PayPal investigators show a level of organization that suggests this wasn't just occasional bad behavior, but organized abuse. The financial effects of clerical sexual corruption were huge. Church investigations from the 13th century showed that up to 30% of monastery budgets in some regions were being spent on what the records gently call special provisions for spiritual comfort. Monasteries that were supposed to be helping the poor and providing education were instead funneling donations into keeping networks of women, buying luxury items for sexual entertainment, and paying bribes to avoid investigation. The corruption reached its absolute peak under Pope Alexander VI, who didn't even pretend to be celibate. He openly acknowledged his children, appointed his son Cesare as a cardinal at age 18, and used his daughter Lucretia as a political pawn in marriage deals while rumors flew about their inappropriately close relationship. Alexander's papal rooms were redesigned to include secret passages that let his mistresses visit without being seen by other Vatican officials. One of the strangest incidents of Alexander's rule involved what he called the Banquet of Chestnuts. In October 1501, according to multiple sources from the time, including the diary of Vatican Master of Ceremonies, Burchard, this dinner party featured 50 prostitutes crawling naked around the papal dining hall, collecting chestnuts, followed by a competition where cardinals got prizes based on how many times they could engage in sexual acts with the women. The event was held in the papal apartments, with religious art looking down on activities that went against every principle of Christian morals. The psychological tricks used by corrupt clergy were especially cruel because they abused people's real religious faith. Many medieval people truly believed that their salvation depended on following church teachings about sexual morals, so they endured real suffering to follow rules that their own priests were openly breaking. The mental conflict must have been unbearable, watching the very men who condemned your natural desires living in luxury paid for by their own sexual excesses. The corruption wasn't just limited to high-ranking church officials. Parish priests throughout Europe were so commonly involved in sexual relationships that church councils issued regular orders trying to fix the problem. The Council of Bourges in 1031 issued penalties for priests who kept mistresses. But by 1059, the problem had become so common that Pope Nicholas II had to issue papal orders threatening excommunication for any priest who kept a sexual relationship. These threats were mostly ignored. A survey of French parishes done in 1074 showed that over 80% of priests were living with women in what were basically common-law marriages. Many had children who were raised in the parish houses, creating this strange situation where celibate priests were actually raising families while preaching about the sinfulness of sexual desire to their congregations. The resistance to celibacy rules was so strong that some regions developed complex workarounds. In parts of Wales and Ireland, priests would have official marriages that were blessed by local bishops, creating a parallel system where clerical celibacy was technically kept in church records while being completely ignored in practice. These marriages were documented in separate records that were hidden from papal investigators. The most tragic victims of this corruption were the women involved with clergy, who had no legal protections and could be thrown away without consequences whenever political pressure grew. The story of Vanessa de Catani, Pope Alexander VI's longest-serving mistress and mother of 4 of his children, shows the risky position of these women. Despite having the Pope's children and managing large Vatican business deals, she could be dismissed at any moment if her presence became politically difficult. When Alexander VI died in 1503, Vanessa was immediately kicked out of the Vatican and stripped of the properties and titles he had given her. Her children's legitimacy was questioned, and she spent her final years fighting legal battles to keep enough resources to survive. Her story was repeated countless times across medieval Europe, as women who had dedicated their lives to relationships with clergy found themselves abandoned when those relationships became problems. The corruption of medieval clergy created a crisis of faith that eventually helped cause the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in 1517. Many of his complaints focus specifically on the sexual hypocrisy of the Catholic Church. Luther's writings show a man who was genuinely angry about the difference between the Church's sexual teachings and the behavior of its leaders. Coming up next, we're exploring a medieval institution that treated human beings like farm animals. The arranged marriage system, where families literally inspected potential brides like they were buying cattle. We'll meet young girls who were married off before they understood what marriage meant, discover the brutal inspections that decided a woman's market value, and follow the heartbreaking story of Agnes de Montoire, who was sold into marriage at I've sold into marriage at age 12, and whose desperate attempts to escape her fate started one of the most shocking legal cases in medieval English history. 12-year-old Agnes de Montoire stood shaking in the cold stone room of Warwick Castle in 1285. Surrounded by women she'd never met who were examining her body like merchants checking goods. They checked her teeth for straightness, felt her arms and legs for strength, and discussed her childbearing potential as if she weren't standing right there, with tears running down her face. This wasn't a medical exam. It was a marriage inspection, and Agnes was the product being valued for purchase by a man 3 times her age whom she had never seen. What happened to Agnes over the next few months shows the brutal reality of medieval arranged marriage, where children were traded like property and young girls found that their bodies, their futures, and their very selves belonged not to them but to families looking for political and money-related gain. The arranged marriage system wasn't just about finding good partners. It was about treating people as strategic assets in a game where women were the money and happiness didn't matter at all. The inspection of Agnes was done according to a detailed set of rules that had been perfected over centuries of treating women like breeding animals. The examining women were experienced older women hired by the groom's family to judge what they called the 4 pillars of marital value: fertility potential, physical strength, good looks, and obedience. Each category had specific points that were checked with the same cold distance used to judge farm animals. For the fertility check, the women examined Agnes's physical growth, measured her hips to see if they were wide enough for having children, and asked her about her menstrual cycle, even though at 12 she had barely started puberty. They wrote everything down in a report that would be sent to her potential husband's family, describing her reproductive future like a livestock breeding guide. The physical strength check was even more degrading. Agnes was made to walk, run, and do physical tasks while the women judged her endurance and strength. They checked her hands for calluses that might show useful work skills, examined her posture for signs of weakness, and even tested her pain tolerance by pinching her arms and watching her reaction. The thinking was that a wife needed to survive multiple pregnancies, handle housework, and put up with whatever physical demands her husband might make on her. Agnes's looks evaluation focused not on beauty in a romantic sense, but on features that would make her husband look good and produce attractive children. The women noted the color and texture of her hair, the straightness of her nose, the size and shape of her breasts, which, at 12 years old, barely existed, and her overall evenness. They were basically creating a genetic profile to predict what kind of children Agnes might have and how she would represent her husband's wealth and taste. But the most disturbing part of the inspection was the obedience check. The examining women deliberately provoked Agnes, gave her conflicting instructions, and watched how she reacted to authority. They wanted to make sure she would be submissive to her husband's demands, follow his family's expectations, and be unlikely to cause trouble by expressing her own thoughts or desires. Agnes's tears and clear fear were actually seen as good signs, proof that she was properly scared of adult authority. The report on Agnes, kept in the Warwick family files, reads like a modern property appraisal. The girl shows adequate development for her age, with promising signs for future fertility. Her physical body appears sound, though she will need several years of proper food to reach full breeding ability. Her appearance is pleasing, without being so eye-catching as to encourage vanity. Most importantly, she shows appropriate submission to authority and shows no signs of willfulness that might create household problems. Agnes was being evaluated for marriage to Sir Geoffrey de Clare, a 35-year-old widower whose previous 2 wives had died in childbirth. The marriage talks had been going on for 6 months, with Agnes's family and Geoffrey's representatives arguing over dowry amounts, property transfers, and the specific terms of the marriage contract. Agnes herself was never asked about any part of these talks. She was simply told that her inspection had been successful and that she would be married within the month. The money-related parts of Agnes's marriage show how completely these arrangements were treated as business deals. Her dowry included 200 acres of farmland, a herd of sheep, household goods worth about £50 a fortune for the time, and what the contract calls exclusive breeding rights to Agnes until she produced 2 male heirs. If Agnes died before finishing this duty, her family would owe Geoffrey money as compensation for the incomplete delivery of contractual services. But Agnes's story takes a dramatic turn that shows both the cruelty of the arranged marriage system and the amazing courage some young women found to fight back. 3 days before her wedding, Agnes disappeared from Warwick Castle. She had managed to escape during the night, taking only a cloak and a small amount of money she had stolen from her mother's jewelry box. For 6 weeks, 12-year-old Agnes survived on her own in medieval England, sleeping in barns, begging for food, and slowly making her way toward a convent, where she hoped to find safety. Her journey shows both her desperation and her amazing cleverness. She disguised herself as a boy, told people she was traveling to visit relatives, and somehow avoided the massive search parties that her family and Geoffrey's men had organized to find her. Agnes's escape caused a scandal that reached the highest levels of English society. The marriage contract between her family and Geoffrey included huge financial penalties for not completing it, and Agnes's disappearance threatened to bankrupt her family while taking away the political connection Geoffrey had bought. Both families asked King Edward I to step in, claiming that Agnes's escape was theft of valuable property. The legal case that followed set important examples about the rights of children in arranged marriages. Agnes was eventually found at the convent of Shaftesbury, where she had successfully claimed sanctuary and was refusing to leave. Church law gave some protection for people seeking religious safety, but it had never been tested in a case involving a child fleeing an arranged marriage. The head of Shaftesbury, a remarkable woman named Mother Eleonora, who had herself been forced into an unwanted marriage before becoming a nun, refused to give up Agnes despite huge pressure from both families and threats from King Edward himself. In her letters to the royal court, Mother Eleonora argued that forcing a terrified child into marriage broke both natural law and Christian teaching about the importance of consent. The case went on for 8 months, during which Agnes lived in the convent, while lawyers argued about whether children could legally refuse arranged marriages. The precedent-setting decision came from a surprise source, Geoffrey de Clare himself, who eventually pulled out of the marriage contract. His stated reason was that a wife who had shown such stubbornness would be impossible to control, but historians believe he was actually influenced by Mother Eleonora's theological arguments about the sinfulness of forced marriage. Agnes's victory came at a huge cost to her family, who were ruined financially by the legal fees and contract penalties. But her case inspired other young women to resist unwanted marriages and helped lead to gradual changes in church law that gave more protections for children in marriage talks. The arranged marriage system created different horrors for families at different economic levels. Wealthy families like Agnes's could afford fancy inspections and talks, but poor families often engaged in what can only be called child trafficking. Girls as young as 8 or 9 would be promised to adult men in exchange for debt forgiveness, food during famines, or protection from local violence. One particularly well-documented case from 1267 involves a 7-year-old girl named Margot, whose family sold her marriage rights to a grain merchant in exchange for 2 bags of wheat during a crop failure. The contract, kept in the files of the Abbey of St. Wouan, specifies that Margot would live with the merchant's family as a servant until she reached marriageable age, defined as when she started her period, at which point the marriage would be completed. Margot's situation was complicated by the fact that she was living basically as a slave in her future husband's house, with no family protection and no legal way out if she was mistreated. The merchant, a man named Philippe, had complete power over every part of her life, from what she ate to when she slept to how she spent every moment of her day. The psychological effect of living in constant expectation of forced marriage was terrible. The inspection rules used for poor girls were often more invasive and humiliating than those used for nobility. Since these families couldn't afford professional older women, the evaluations were often done by the buyer's female relatives, who had obvious reasons to find flaws that might justify paying a lower bride price. Girls from poor families told stories of being put through exams that included private physical checks and cruel tests of their ability to handle pain and emotional hardship. The saddest part of the medieval marriage inspection system was how it taught young girls to see their own bodies as objects for sale rather than as part of who they were. Girls grew up knowing that their physical looks, their ability to have children, and their emotional nature would decide their whole future, but that they had no say in any part of the evaluation process. Many developed what we would now see as serious anxiety problems and body image issues. Medieval medical books describe young women who would hurt themselves on purpose to avoid marriage inspections, who developed eating problems trying to control their physical growth, and who showed signs of what modern psychologists would call disconnection and depression. Some families came up with detailed plans to show their daughters in the best possible way during inspections. Rich families would hire special teachers to teach girls how to walk, talk, and act during these exams. They would use makeup to improve or hide certain features, special diets to speed up or slow down physical growth, and even basic acting skills to show the right levels of obedience and quietness. The most successful marriage talks often had multiple rounds of inspections, with different evaluators brought in to confirm the first judgments. This meant that young girls might be put through repeated exams over months or even years, creating ongoing pain that could last long after the marriage was set. Coming up next, we're diving into the dangerous world of medieval medicine's view of sex. where doctors gave treatments that were more likely to kill patients than cure them. We'll meet doctors who believed that letting blood could cure too much lust. Find out how the four humors theory led to medical practices that made no sense. And follow the sad story of Lady Catherine of York, whose treatment for feminine hysteria nearly cost her her life and showed just how little medieval doctors understood about the human body they claimed to heal. Blood dripped slowly from Lady Catherine of York's arms into the silver bowl below as Master Aldrich, the royal doctor, nodded with approval at his work. It was 1347, and Catherine had made the mistake of telling her husband that she'd been having what she called impure dreams about their private life together. Her husband, worried about her spiritual health, had called for England's most respected doctor to cure what medieval medicine called excessive feminine heat, a condition they believed could drive women to madness, cheating, or even witchcraft if not treated. Master Aldrich's solution was bloodletting, and a lot of it. According to medieval medical theory, sexual desire in women was caused by a mix-up of the four humors. Specifically, too much hot and moist blood gathering in the lower parts of the body. The cure was to drain enough blood to fix the balance, cooling the patient's desire and returning her to the properly quiet state that medieval medicine thought was healthy for women. Over the course of 3 days, Master Aldrich took out nearly 2 pints of blood from Lady Catherine's body. By modern medical standards, this was enough to cause serious anemia, weakness, and possibly death. But medieval doctors saw these signs as good things, proof that the treatment was working. Catherine's pale skin and tiredness were seen as proof that her dangerous sexual heat had been successfully cooled. The medieval understanding of sex was based on the old theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was linked with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and doctors believed that all physical and mental conditions were caused by imbalances among these fluids. Sexual desire was labeled as a hot and wet condition, which meant that treatments focused on adding cold and dry elements to fix the balance. For men, too much sexual desire was treated with cold baths, bitter herbs, and food rules that avoided heating foods like meat, wine, and spices. But for women, the treatments were much more extreme because medieval medicine saw female sexuality as naturally more dangerous and unstable than male sexuality. Women were believed to have naturally cooler natures, so any sign of sexual passion was seen as a serious medical emergency. Master Aldrich's medical notes, saved in the Royal College of Physicians records, show the full range of medieval sexual medicine's dangerous lack of knowledge. He ordered treatments that included not only bloodletting, but also purging with poisonous herbs, cold water enemas given with simple syringes, and what he called cooling pessaries, suppositories, made from lead and mercury that were put into the vagina to directly fight excessive feminine heat. The lead and mercury suppositories were based on the medieval belief that metals had cooling qualities that could balance hot humors. What medieval doctors didn't understand was that lead and mercury are highly poisonous things that would cause lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, and severe chemical burns to sensitive body parts. Lady Catherine's medical records describe symptoms that we now recognize as heavy metal poisoning, shaking, confusion, hair loss, and severe stomach pain. But Master Aldrich saw these as positive signs that the treatment was working. Perhaps the strangest part of medieval sexual medicine was the idea of wandering womb syndrome, a condition that supposedly affected women whose sexual desires had caused their uterus to literally move around inside their body, causing various physical and mental symptoms. This theory, taken from ancient Greek medicine, led to treatments that were both silly and dangerous. Women diagnosed with wandering womb syndrome were put through treatments designed to coax their uterus back into its right place. These included fumigating the vagina with smoke from burning, sweet-smelling herbs, putting strong-smelling things like garlic or fish on the genitals, and in extreme cases, inserting weighted devices to hold the womb in place. The medical thinking was that the uterus was attracted to pleasant smells and pushed away by unpleasant ones. So doctors would put nice smells in the area where they wanted the womb to settle, and bad smells in areas they wanted it to avoid. Lady Catherine was diagnosed with a type of wandering womb syndrome that Master Aldrich called ascending hysteria, a condition where too many sexual thoughts supposedly cause the uterus to rise toward the heart, creating emotional instability and moral badness. His treatment plan included daily fumigation sessions where Catherine had to crouch over a heater filled with burning herbs while smoke was aimed into her vagina using a simple funnel system. The fumigation treatments used a mix of herbs that modern science recognizes as highly poisonous. Pennyroyal, one of the main ingredients, has chemicals that can cause liver failure and death. Tansy can cause seizures and organ damage. Wormwood has things that affect the mind and can be deadly in large doses. Lady Catherine was basically being poisoned daily in the name of medical treatment. Medieval doctors also believed that sexual desire could be cured through changing one's diet based on the heating and cooling qualities of different foods. Master Aldrich put Lady Catherine on a strict diet that cut out all hot foods. Meat, wine, spices, eggs, and even honey were not allowed. Instead, she had to eat only cooling foods like lettuce, cucumber, and barley, along with daily doses of what medieval medicine called cooling waters, watered-down vinegar mixed with powdered limestone. This diet plan was designed to gradually cool Lady Catherine's entire body temperature, which would then lower her sexual desire. What it actually did was create serious nutritional problems that weakened her immune system, messed up her hormone balance, and caused the muscle weakness and mental confusion that medieval doctors thought was a successful treatment of her condition. The most dangerous part of medieval sexual medicine was the use of mercury as a treatment for what doctors called excessive Venusian influence, their term for any sexual behavior they thought was wrong. Mercury was believed to have special qualities that could fight the planet Venus's supposed influence on human sexuality. Patients were given mercury in various forms, dissolved in wine, put on as skin creams, or inserted as suppositories. Master Aldrich's treatment notes describe giving Lady Catherine daily doses of mercury dissolved in white wine, thinking that the combination would cool her blood, while the mercury would provide a direct counteraction to Venus's influences. Modern medicine understands that mercury is one of the most dangerous nerve toxins known to humans, causing brain damage, kidney failure, and death even in small amounts. Lady Catherine's symptoms during treatment, shaking, memory loss, and difficulty speaking, were classic signs of mercury poisoning. But Master Aldrich saw them as proof that the treatment was successfully driving out the evil influences that were causing her sexual thoughts. The economic abuse built into medieval sexual medicine was huge. Rich families like Lady Catherine's paid enormous amounts for treatments that were not only useless but actively harmful. Master Aldrich charged the same as a skilled worker's yearly pay for his month-long treatment plan. While the rare and expensive ingredients like mercury and exotic herbs created a profitable market for fakes and real doctors alike, poor families who couldn't afford professional medical treatment often turned to folk cures that were sometimes safer than what trained doctors offered, simply because they couldn't afford the more dangerous, complex treatments. Village-wise, women might suggest herbal teas that were fairly harmless, while rich patients were put through bloodletting, mercury poisoning, and other possibly deadly procedures. Medieval medical texts show doctors who were completely sure of treatments that we now know were deadly. The medical book De Secretis Mulierum, written by Albertus Magnus around 1250, has detailed instructions for treating female sexual problems, using methods that included burning sulfur near the patient's genitals, putting leeches on the inner thighs, and giving enemas containing wine, honey, and powdered human skull. The psychological effect of these medical treatments was as damaging as the physical effects. Women like Lady Catherine learned to fear and hold back their natural sexual feelings, not just because of religious and social pressure, but because expressing any sexual interest could result in being put through treatments that were basically torture disguised as medicine. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe sexual problems and PTSD from medical procedures designed to cure their sexuality. Some medieval doctors did begin to question how well traditional treatments worked, though they had to be careful about challenging established medical authority. A doctor named Master Thomas of Canterbury wrote in 1289 about his observations that patients put through mercury treatments often developed symptoms that seemed worse than their original problems. But he framed his worries in terms of wrong dosing rather than challenging the basic theory behind the treatments. The saddest part of medieval sexual medicine was how it created a cycle of suffering that reinforced itself. Women who were treated for sexual desire often developed real medical and psychological problems as a result of the treatments, which doctors then saw as proof that the original sexual symptoms had been more serious than they first thought, which justified even more aggressive procedures. Lady Catherine's story has a surprisingly hopeful ending that shows the strength of the human spirit, even under the most oppressive medical situations. After nearly dying from her treatments, she convinced her husband that she'd been cured of her sexual desires and persuaded him to fire Master Aldrich. Her private letters, found centuries later, show that she had learned to hide her true feelings while privately keeping her sense of self and her ability to feel joy. She lived for another 30 years, outliving her husband and eventually starting a small convent where she provided a safe place for other women fleeing medical or marital abuse. Coming up next, we're exploring the medieval obsession with aphrodisiacs that turned the search for sexual enhancement into a deadly game of Russian roulette. We'll discover how the wealthy literally paid fortunes for things that were more likely to kill them than ignite their passions. Meet the fakes who sold ground unicorn horn and powdered phoenix feathers to desperate nobles, and uncover the shocking murder of Duke Richard of Normandy, whose search for the perfect love potion ended in a palace scandal that shook medieval Europe. Duke Richard of Normandy collapsed, twisting on the marble floor of his palace dining hall, foam pouring from his mouth as his dinner guests watched in horror. Minutes earlier, he had been toasting his upcoming wedding night with what he believed was the most powerful aphrodisiac ever made. A mixture containing ground rhinoceros horn, powdered pearls, and what his merchant had sworn was real unicorn blood. Instead of boosting his romantic skills, the potion was killing him with a mix of arsenic, lead, and mercury that would have impressed a Renaissance poisoner. The Duke's death in 1342 was far from the only one in medieval Europe where the search for sexual enhancement had created a booming business of fake aphrodisiacs that were often more deadly than exciting. The medieval obsession with love potions and passion boosters shows a fascinating contradiction. While the church was busy suppressing sexuality, wealthy nobles were literally willing to risk their lives for things they believed would make them irresistible lovers. The aphrodisiac trade worked in the shady edges of medieval business, where merchants sold exotic things to customers who were too embarrassed to admit they were buying sexual aids. These deals took place in private rooms, hidden market stalls, and through secret letters that mentioned strengthening tonics and marital aids, while talking about things that cost more than most people's yearly income. Duke Richard's deadly aphrodisiac was made by a merchant named Jacopo de Fieschi, who had built a name across Europe for creating the strongest love potions available to the nobility. Jacopo's list of goods, found after the Duke's death, reads like a fantasy novel's ingredient list: phoenix feathers from the Holy Land, mermaid scales from the North Sea, powdered dragon heart from the mountains of Wales, and basilisk venom that supposedly came from the deserts of Africa. Of course, none of these ingredients were what Jacopo said they were. Modern analysis of surviving samples from his workshop shows that his phoenix feathers were actually dyed chicken feathers treated with mercury. His mermaid scales were fish, scales coated with lead paint. And his dragon heart was powdered beef organ mixed with arsenic-based colors that gave it a fittingly magical red color. The basilisk venom was pure antimony, a toxic metal that would cause severe poisoning in even small doses. What made Jacopo's business model particularly evil is how he used medieval people's complete lack of understanding about chemistry and medicine. His customers had no way to check if his ingredients were real, and the higher the price he charged, the more convinced they became that his products must be truly magical. Duke Richard paid 500 gold florins for his deadly aphrodisiac, enough money to buy a small castle specifically because the huge EGEs cost convinced him it must contain genuinely powerful ingredients. The medieval aphrodisiac industry was built on a base of sexual anxiety that the Church's restrictive teachings had created. Men who had been taught that sexual desire was sinful often developed performance problems. When they tried to be intimate with their wives, instead of seeing this as a psychological issue created by religious guilt, they assumed they needed magical help to function properly as husbands. Women faced different but equally hard pressures. Medieval wives were expected to be passionate, enough to satisfy their husbands and have children, but quiet enough to avoid being accused of too much lust. Many turned to aphrodisiacs not to increase their own desire, but to make sure they could respond properly to their husband's demands, without seeming too eager or too unwilling. The most expensive aphrodisiacs were those that claimed to be made from parts of mythical creatures. Unicorn horn was seen as the ultimate aphrodisiac because medieval people believed unicorns represented pure sexual power. A single ounce of what merchants claimed was real unicorn horn could cost more than a skilled worker earned in 5 years. In reality, these unicorn horns were usually narwhal tusks, rhinoceros horns, or even carved elephant ivory. But the desperate buyers paid huge prices without question. Lady Isabella de Browse's purchase records from 1335, kept in the Browse family files, show the staggering amounts wealthy women spent on aphrodisiacs. Over the course of 1 year, she bought love-enhancing things that included powdered pearls. For 200 gold marks, crushed emeralds that cost 150 marks, and a small vial of what the merchant claimed was tears of Venus for 300 marks. Her total aphrodisiac spending for that single year was more than the yearly tax income of some English counties. What Lady Isabella was actually buying was a collection of things that ranged from harmless but useless to actively dangerous. The powdered pearls were real, but had no aphrodisiac effects beyond the psychological boost of eating something expensive. The crushed emeralds were often green-tinted glass mixed with copper compounds that could cause digestive problems and skin discoloration. The tears of Venus was likely a mixture of rosewater and mercury that would have caused gradual heavy metal poisoning. The psychology behind medieval aphrodisiac use shows how completely the Church's sexual teachings had twisted people's understanding of their own bodies. Many customers genuinely believed that sexual pleasure was supernatural rather than natural, so it made sense to them that enhancing it would require magical help. They had been taught that human sexuality was fundamentally corrupted by sin, so they assumed that good sexual experiences must come from outside sources rather than from healthy relationships and self-understanding. Some medieval doctors tried to profit from the aphrodisiac market while keeping up a look of medical respectability. Master Guillaume de Salcedo, court doctor to 3 different popes in Avignon, wrote a lot about what he called restorative therapies for marital harmony. His prescriptions included exotic ingredients like ambergris from whale intestines, musk from Tibetan deer, and what he claimed were specially prepared orchid roots from the mountains of India. Master Guillaume's medical approach was more sophisticated than the obvious fakes, but his treatments were still based on the fundamentally flawed medieval understanding of sexuality as a bodily imbalance that could be fixed through the right combination of substances. His most expensive prescription combined ambergris, gold leaf, crushed pearls, and powdered rhinoceros horn in a mixture that cost more than most noble families spent on food in an entire year. The international trade in aphrodisiac ingredients created some of the medieval world's most profitable smuggling operations. Merchants would travel thousands of miles to get rare things, often making false claims about their origins to justify charging higher prices. The Red Book of Marco Polo, found in a Venetian monastery in 1987, contains detailed notes about the aphrodisiac trade routes that connected Europe with Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. According to Polo's notes, Chinese traders were selling European merchants things they claimed were powdered tiger penis, dried phoenix blood, and scales from sexual dragons. Meanwhile, European merchants were selling Asian customers what they claimed were crushed unicorn horns, mermaid tears, and hair from angels of love. The entire international trade was built on mutual lying, with each culture creating complex myths to sell exotic but ultimately worthless things to foreign buyers. The most tragic victims of the aphrodisiac trade were often young couples, whose marriages were struggling not because of any physical problems, but because of the psychological damage caused by medieval sexual education. Instead of learning to communicate with each other and develop healthy closeness, they turned to expensive and dangerous things that promised magical solutions to problems that could have been solved through patience, understanding, and better information about human sexuality. One particularly heartbreaking case comes from the court records of King Charles IV of France, involving a young nobleman named Henry de Montmorency, who bankrupted his family buying aphrodisiacs because his new wife seemed uninterested in physical closeness. The investigation that followed showed that Henry's wife wasn't lacking in sexual desire. She was terrified of closeness because her mother had filled her head with stories about the pain and danger of sexual relations. Instead of dealing with her fears through gentle conversation and patience, Henry spent a fortune on love potions. That only made the situation worse by putting more pressure on both of them to achieve magical romantic changes. The aphrodisiac industry also created opportunities for clever murder plots disguised as romantic enhancement. The death of Duke Richard of Normandy was eventually traced to his younger brother, who had bribed Jacopo de Fieschi to create a love potion that was actually a carefully measured poison. The brother inherited the duchy and was never charged because medieval law enforcement lacked the scientific knowledge to prove that the aphrodisiac had been deliberately poisoned. Similar cases happened throughout medieval Europe, as the combination of expensive, rare ingredients and secret buying made aphrodisiacs the perfect delivery method for poisons. Victims were often unwilling to seek medical help quickly because they were embarrassed about taking sexual enhancement substances. The poison more time to work before treatment could be tried. Perhaps the most bizarre part of the medieval aphrodisiac trade was how it created a parallel economy where normal economic rules didn't apply. The higher the price of a substance, the more effective customers believed it would be. Merchants found they could increase demand for their products simply by raising prices and creating more elaborate origin stories for their ingredients. This market reached its peak of absurdity with the sale of philosophers' aphrodisiacs, substances that merchants claimed had been created through alchemical processes that combined sexual enhancement with spiritual transformation. These products promised not just physical arousal, but transcendent romantic experiences that would lift customers to higher planes of existence. The prices were so extreme that only royal families could afford them, and the ingredients lists read like recipes for poison rather than passion. Coming up next, we're diving into the steamy, soap-slicked world of medieval bathhouses, places that began as spots for personal hygiene, but grew into something that would make modern adult entertainment venues look tame. We'll explore how these places became the centers of medieval sexual business, discover why the church declared war on cleanliness itself, and meet Marguerite Le Maître, whose bathhouse in medieval Paris was so infamous that it attracted customers from across Europe and eventually started a riot that burned down half the city. Steam rose from the carved wooden tubs as Marguerite Le Maître looked over her empire from the balcony of her Parisian bathhouse in 1348. Below her, nobles and merchants mixed naked in the warm waters while carefully chosen workers provided services that went far beyond simple washing. What had started as a respectable place for personal hygiene had grown into something that made Roman orgies look like church picnics. And Marguerite was making more money than some entire kingdoms. Medieval bathhouses started innocently enough as public places where people could bathe in an age when private baths were luxury items only the wealthy could afford. But somewhere between the warm water, the naked bodies, and the private nature of washing, these places changed into something entirely different. They became the red light districts of medieval Europe, where sex, business, and social rebellion came together in ways that would eventually cause a moral panic that destroyed the entire industry. Marguerite's establishment, known as Le Bain de Venus, was the most infamous bathhouse in medieval Europe. Her clientele included French nobles, English merchants, Italian bankers, and even high-ranking clergy who arrived disguised in plain robes but left generous donations for the charitable work being done inside. The bathhouse operated under the thin disguise of providing healing bathing services. But everyone knew the real business being done in the private rooms and hidden corners. The layout of Marguerite's bathhouse shows how these places grew to serve their two purposes. The main bathing hall had large shared tubs where mixed-gender bathing was encouraged, something that would have been scandalous in any other setting. Private rooms lined the upper floors, each with smaller tubs, comfortable beds, and what the account books gently describe as specialized bathing equipment. The basement had what Marguerite called her treatment rooms, where customers could get massages and other services that definitely weren't limited to healing muscle work. The financial success of medieval bathhouses was huge. Marguerite's financial records, kept in the Archives Nationales in Paris, show that Le Bain de Venus generated more income than some of France's major trading companies. In 1347, her establishment collected over 20,000 livres in bathing fees, enough money to buy a small castle. The profits came not just from the basic services, but from a complex pricing system that charged high rates for privacy, secrecy, and specialized entertainment. The most expensive services at Marguerite's bathhouse were the Venus treatments, private sessions that cost more than a skilled worker's monthly wages. These sessions took place in specially decorated rooms, where customers could enjoy what the price list described as complete restoration of bodily humors through intimate cleansing rituals. The vague language fooled no one, but it provided legal protection against church authorities who were constantly looking for excuses to shut down these places. Medieval bathhouse culture created a unique social world where normal class differences temporarily vanished. Nobles and merchants, who would never mix in public, found themselves sharing tubs and private conversations in the democratic nakedness of the baths. This social mixing terrified church and political leaders, who saw that bathhouses were becoming centers of political talk and social networking that worked outside their control. The workers at Marguerite's bathhouse came from varied backgrounds that show the complex economics of medieval sex work. Some were women from poor families who saw bath work as their best financial chance in a society that offered few others. Others were educated women who had lost their social standing through widowhood, scandal, or family bankruptcy. A few were actually from noble families who had fallen on hard times and needed to earn money while keeping some appearance of respectability. Marguerite's employment contracts, found in a sealed chest during 19th century renovations, show that she treated her workers far better than most medieval employers. Bath workers received not just wages, but also food, housing, medical care, and protection from violent customers. They were allowed to refuse services they found unpleasant, and Marguerite kept a fund to support workers who became pregnant or needed to leave the business. This progressive approach to work relations made her establishment popular with workers and added to its reputation for quality service. The Church's opposition to bathhouses went far beyond moral complaints about the sexual services being provided. Religious leaders saw that bathhouse culture challenged basic Christian teachings about shame, the body, and social order. When people gathered naked in warm water, sharing private conversations and physical pleasures, they were feeling exactly the kind of earthly joy that the Church taught was not compatible with spiritual salvation. The theological arguments against bathhouses became more and more desperate as their popularity grew. Church documents from the time argue that shared bathing was sinful because it recreated the conditions of the Garden of Eden before the fall, when Adam and Eve felt no shame about their nakedness. According to this thinking, bathhouses were literally satanic places that tempted people to reject the shame that God had put on humanity as punishment for original sin. By 1340, the Church had launched a full-scale propaganda campaign against bathing itself, arguing that cleanliness was a form of vanity that distracted people from spiritual worries. Sermons from the time described bathing as a gateway sin that led without fail to lust, pride, and corruption. Some priests went so far as to argue that dirt and body odor were signs of humility and devotion, making cleanliness itself a form of disrespect to God. The most extreme anti-bathing sermon was given by Brother Bernardino of Siena in 1427, who declared that the devil himself invented hot water to corrupt Christian souls. He argued that public bathhouses were doorways to hell, where demons tempted the faithful with earthly pleasures that would doom their eternal souls. His sermon was so powerful that several Italian cities actually banned public bathing entirely, forcing people to choose between cleanliness and salvation. Despite Church opposition, bathhouse culture continued to thrive because it met needs that medieval society couldn't address through any other place. In an era when most people lived in crowded, dirty conditions with no privacy, bathhouses provided clean, warm spaces where individuals could experience physical comfort and close connection. For many medieval people, bathhouses were the only places where they could experience pleasure without shame or fear of punishment. The social dynamics within bathhouses created chances for relationships that would have been impossible in ordinary medieval society. Marguerite's establishment became famous for helping romantic connections between people from different social classes, different regions, and even different countries. Her guest books contain love poems written by customers who met their future spouses while sharing a bath, creating relationships that cross boundaries that were normally impossible to break. One of the most remarkable love stories from La Bain de Venus involves Geoffroy de Montmorency, a French knight, and Catalina de Milano, the daughter of an Italian silk merchant. They met while both were visiting Marguerite's establishment during a trade fair in 1346. Despite the fact that their families were political enemies and their marriage would normally have been impossible, they had a courtship that took place entirely within the bathhouse, using Marguerite as a go-between to arrange secret meetings and exchange gifts. The knight and the merchant's daughter eventually ran away together, creating a scandal that reached the courts of both France and Italy. But their marriage turned out to be remarkably successful, producing 6 children and lasting over 30 years. In his private memoirs, Sir Geoffroy credited the unique environment of the bathhouse with allowing him to see past social rules and recognize Catalina's true character in a way that normal courtship rituals would never have allowed. The economics of medieval bathhouses went far beyond the fees charged for services. These places became centers of business where deals were negotiated, political alliances were formed, and information was exchanged. Merchants would conduct trade talks while soaking in warm water, finding that the relaxed atmosphere led to better agreements than formal business meetings. Politicians would use bathhouse visits to hold secret conferences that couldn't be watched by their enemies. Marguerite's bathhouse became so central to Parisian business life that she began offering specialized services for business travelers. Foreign merchants could rent private rooms for conducting talks, complete with scribes who could record agreements and witnesses who could verify contracts. The bathhouse's reputation for secrecy made it the preferred place for deals that needed to be kept secret from competitors or political authorities. The international reputation of Le Bain de Venus attracted visitors from across Europe, turning the establishment into an unofficial cultural embassy where people from different countries could meet and exchange ideas. Italian Renaissance artists would discuss techniques with Flemish painters while sharing baths. German scholars would debate philosophy with French intellectuals. English nobles would negotiate marriage alliances with Spanish aristocrats. The bathhouse became a melting pot where European culture was literally being created through intimate cross-cultural exchanges. But this golden age of bathhouse culture came to a sudden and violent end when the Black Death reached Paris in 1348. The plague killed nearly half the city's population, and surviving church leaders took the opportunity to blame the disaster on the moral corruption they claimed bathhouses represented. What followed was a planned campaign of destruction that would remove public bathing from European culture for the next 3 centuries. Coming up next, we're exploring the darkest chapter in our journey through medieval sexuality, the twisted, legal system that treated rape not as a violent crime against a person, but as property theft committed against a woman's male guardian. We'll discover how medieval rape laws were designed to protect men's economic interests rather than women's bodily autonomy. Meet victims whose stories reveal the brutal reality of seeking justice in a system that viewed them as damaged goods rather than human beings, and uncover how these legal precedents shaped attitudes towards sexual violence that persisted well into the modern era. The court clerk's pen scratched methodically across the parchment as he recorded the most chilling legal statement in medieval English law concerning the complaint of rape brought by Emma de Norris against Sir William de Braose. The court finds that as the victim was unmarried and of common birth, the damages shall be assessed not for harm to her person, but for the theft of her father's property in her virginity, valued at 3 sheep and a bushel of grain. This wasn't a fluke in medieval justice. This was the system working exactly as it was meant to. In 1284, Emma de Norris had been violently attacked by a nobleman, but the court's main concern wasn't her pain, her injuries, or her rights as a human being. The legal system saw rape through the lens of property damage, where women's bodies belonged to their fathers or husbands, and sexual violence was prosecuted as theft rather than assault. Medieval rape law shows perhaps the most disturbing part of how completely women were dehumanized by the legal and social systems of the time. When we look at court records from across medieval Europe, we find a justice system that was designed not to protect women from sexual violence, but to protect men's financial and social investments in women's sexual purity. The law didn't see women as victims. It saw their male guardians as the wronged parties in property crimes. The legal basis for rape prosecution was based on the idea of defloratio. Damage the idea that a woman's virginity was a valuable item that belonged to her father until marriage, at which point ownership moved to her husband. If that item was stolen through rape, the crime was against the property owner, not against the woman herself. This legal thinking created a system where the punishment for rape depended not on how bad the violence was, but on the social status and economic value of the woman who was attacked. Emma de Norris's case shows how this system worked in practice. As an unmarried peasant woman, her virginity value was judged to be the same as livestock, because that's what her father might have gotten as part of a dowry talk with a husband of similar social standing. Sir William de Braose, her attacker, was required to pay this amount as compensation not to Emma, but to her father. Emma herself got nothing and had no legal right to ask for more compensation for her physical injuries, emotional pain, or social shame. But the unfairness went much deeper than just compensation amounts. The legal system created different categories of rape based on the victim's social class, with vastly different punishments for attacking women of different economic levels. The rape of a noblewoman was seen as a serious crime because it damaged valuable property and could affect political alliances through marriage talks. The rape of a peasant woman was barely seen as a crime at all, more like stealing a chicken than committing a serious felony. The case of Lady Margaret de Clare in 1298 shows how differently the system treated wealthy victims. When Lady Margaret was attacked by a group of bandits while traveling between her family's estates, the legal response was quick and harsh. The attackers were sentenced to death, not because they had committed sexual violence, but because they had damaged property worth thousands of pounds and threatened a political alliance between two powerful families. Lady Margaret's virginity value was judged at over £500, enough money to buy several villages because her planned marriage to a French duke was worth huge political and economic benefits to both England and France. The court's main concern wasn't Lady Margaret's suffering, but the fact that her assault had put an international treaty that had taken years to negotiate at risk. Even more disturbing was how the legal system handled cases where the victim's social status was unclear. Mixed-class rape cases often turned into complex legal proceedings, where courts had to decide the exact economic value of the victim's sexual purity based on her family's wealth, her education, her physical appearance, and her chances for marriage. These judgments were done like property appraisals, with expert witnesses called to testify about the victim's market value as a potential bride. The trial records of Isabella de Fortebus from 1289 show how strange these proceedings could become. Isabella was the daughter of a merchant who had been attacked by a minor nobleman. The court spent 3 days hearing testimony about whether Isabella's merchant background made her valuable enough to deserve serious punishment for her attacker, or whether her non-noble status meant the crime should be treated as a minor property theft. Witnesses were called to testify about Isabella's education, her musical skills, her needlework abilities, and even her physical measurements. As the court tried to calculate exactly how much her assault had damaged her father's economic prospects, the final ruling declared that Isabella's value fell into a middle category, making her rape a moderate crime worthy of a fine rather than physical punishment. Decision that essentially priced sexual violence like a luxury tax. The most horrific part of medieval rape law was how it created reasons for attackers to target vulnerable women who had little legal protection. Poor women, widows, foreign women, and those without male guardians could be attacked with few legal consequences because they had no property value worth protecting. This created a two-tiered system where wealthy women got significant legal protection, while poor women were essentially outside the law's protection entirely. Court records from London's Westminster courts showed that over 80% of rape prosecutions involved victims from wealthy families, not because noble women were more likely to be attacked, but because attacks on poor women were rarely prosecuted at all. When poor women did try to bring rape cases to court, they often faced counter-accusations of theft, prostitution, or false accusation that could result in severe punishment for the victim. The legal steps for proving rape were designed around the property damage model in ways that made prosecution extremely difficult for victims. The main evidence required was proof of forced defloratio medical testimony that the victim had been a virgin, and that her hymen had been torn through. Violence. This requirement immediately excluded any woman who had been sexually active, had done certain types of physical labor, or simply didn't fit the narrow physical standards that medieval medicine used to define virginity. The medical exams required. for rape prosecution were done by male doctors or midwives who had been appointed by the court, not chosen by the victim. These exams were often more traumatic than the original assault, involving detailed physical inspection and private questioning about the victim's sexual history. The proceedings were done in open court, meaning that the most private details of the victim's body and experience became public knowledge. Perhaps most twisted part of medieval rape law was the marriage cure rule that existed in many areas. This legal principle said that if a rapist married his victim, the crime would be considered solved because the stolen property had been transferred to its thief through proper legal means. The thinking was that marriage restored the woman's honor and gave her economic support, while paying back her family for their property loss through the standard dowry talks. The marriage cure created situations where rape victims were forced to choose between marrying their attackers or facing social shame and financial ruin. Families often pressured rape victims to accept these marriages because the alternative was having an unmarriageable daughter who would be a financial burden for life. The legal system that was supposed to provide justice instead created a way for rapists to legitimize their crimes through forced marriage. The case of Agnes de la Poer in 1312 shows how the marriage cure worked in practice. Agnes was raped by Sir Robert de Mortimer, who then offered to marry her to resolve the legal charges against him. Agnes's family pressured her to accept the marriage because Sir Robert's social status was higher than what they could normally get for their daughter. The court records show that Agnes repeatedly said she did not want to marry her attacker. But the judge ruled that the marriage would be good for all parties and ordered the ceremony to go ahead. Agnes lived in this forced marriage for over 20 years, having 6 children with the man who had raped her. Her private letters, found centuries later, show a woman who never recovered from the pain of being forced to share her life with her attacker. She wrote about feeling like a prisoner in her own home, about the constant reminder of her assault every time she looked at her husband, and about the bitter irony that the legal system had rewarded her rapist with exactly what he had wanted. All along, the international differences in medieval rape law show how different societies structured the same basic idea that women's bodies belonged to men. In some Germanic regions, rape was treated as a form of theft that could be solved through financial payment. In French lands, rape of noble women was considered treason because it damaged the king's political interests. In Italian city-states, rape laws focused mainly on protecting family honor and business relationships. The most progressive medieval rape laws were found in some Scandinavian regions, where legal codes actually recognized women as having some personal interest in their own sexual freedom. Even these laws, however, still treated rape mainly as property damage, just with slightly more recognition that the victim herself had been harmed, in addition to her male guardian's economic interests. The psychological effect of medieval rape law on both victims and society was devastating and long-lasting. Women learned that their value as human beings was entirely dependent on their sexual status, and that sexual violence against them would be judged mainly in terms of economic damage to men. This legal framework strengthened social attitudes that treated women as property and normalized sexual violence as a form of theft rather than assault. The legacy of medieval rape law lasted far longer than the Middle Ages themselves. Many of the legal ideas that treated rape as a property crime, rather than a personal assault, survived in various forms well into the modern era. The idea that a woman's sexual history was relevant to a rape prosecution, the need for physical evidence of violence, and the assumption that false accusations were common all have their roots in medieval legal thinking that valued property rights over personal freedom. Coming up next, we're entering the world of courtly love, the elaborate romantic fantasy that medieval literature created to hide the brutal reality of actual relationships. We'll discover how troubadour poetry and chivalric romance created impossible standards that made real closeness even more difficult. Meet Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose attempts to live out courtly love ideals in real life created scandals that shook the foundations of medieval Europe, and explore how these romantic fantasies became tools of social control that kept people trapped in cycles of feeling unfulfilled and blaming themselves. Eleanor of Aquitaine stood at the window of her tower in Poitiers Castle in 1170, reading a love poem that would have made her grandmother weep with laughter. The troubadour's words described her as a divine goddess whose mere look could heal wounded hearts and whose voice was sweeter than angels singing in paradise. The reality was that Eleanor was a 48-year-old woman who had been married twice for political reasons, had given birth to 10 children, and was currently planning a rebellion against her husband, King Henry II of England. But according to the courtly love tradition she had helped create, she was supposed to be a heavenly, untouchable figure who inspired pure, sexless devotion from knights who would never dare approach her. The gap between courtly love literature and medieval reality was so huge it was almost silly. While troubadours sang about knights who would die for a single smile from their beloved, real medieval marriages were business deals where love was not just unimportant, but possibly dangerous to family interests. The romantic poetry that has shaped our understanding of medieval relationships was actually a form of complex fantasy that had almost nothing to do with how people actually lived, loved, and formed close connections. Courtly love, or fenamers, as it was originally called, was invented in the courts of southern France during the 12th century as a form of fancy entertainment for bored nobles. The idea was groundbreaking. It suggested that love should be spiritual rather than physical, that it should involve worship of an idealized woman from a distance, and that the greatest romantic fulfillment came not from completion, but from endless longing and devotion. It was basically a medieval version of unrequited love fan fiction, and it became the most influential romantic ideal in Western culture. Eleanor herself was one of the main supporters of this courtly love tradition, funding troubadours and poets who created increasingly complex fantasies about perfect romantic love. Her court at Poitiers became the center of what historians call the courts of love, literally theatrical performances, where nobles would hold fake trials to argue questions like, is it possible to love one's own spouse? Or can true love exist without jealousy? These weren't serious philosophical talks. They were parlor games that turned real human emotions into abstract intellectual exercises. The rules of courtly love, written down in Andreas Capellanus's book, The Art of Courtly Love, around 1184, created a romantic framework that was specifically designed to be impossible to achieve in real life. According to these rules, true love had to be adulterous because married love was dirtied by legal and economic duties. The beloved had to be of higher social status than her admirer, making the relationship naturally unequal. The love had to remain uncompleted because physical closeness would destroy its spiritual purity. And the lover had to suffer constantly from unfulfilled desire because happiness would end the ennobling effects of romantic longing. These rules created a romantic ideal that was not just impractical, but actively harmful to real relationships. Young nobles grew up reading poetry that taught them that true love was supposed to be painful, possible, and focused on someone they couldn't have. Meanwhile, they were expected to enter practical marriages with people they were supposed to treat as business partners rather than romantic interests. The psychological damage from trying to balance these conflicting expectations was huge. The case of Geoffroy de Montmorency shows how destructive the courtly love ideal could be in practice. Geoffroy was a young knight who became obsessed with the courtly love poetry of Etienne de Troyes and decided to pursue his own fenamers relationship with Lady Isabelle de Lusignan, a married noblewoman known for her beauty and intelligence. Geoffroy spent 3 years writing love letters, composing poetry, and performing elaborate acts of devotion that were designed to show his pure spiritual love for Lady Isabel. The problem was that Geoffroy's wife, Catherine, was watching her. Husband give all his emotional energy to another woman while treating their marriage as a mere legal convenience. Catherine's letters to her sister, kept in the Montmorency family files, show a woman who felt completely abandoned by a husband, who was physically present but emotionally distant. Geoffroy believed he was following the highest romantic ideals of his culture, while Catherine felt like she was married to a stranger who saved all his passion for someone else. The situation got worse when Lady Isabel, who had at first been amused by Geoffroy's courtly attention, became genuinely attracted to him and suggested they move beyond the abstract spiritual love that courtly tradition demanded. Geoffroy was horrified. According to the courtly love code, physical completion would destroy the purity of their relationship and end his spiritual growth through romantic suffering. He rejected her advances, leaving Lady Isabel feeling shamed and rejected. The final tragedy came when Catherine, driven to desperation by years of emotional neglect, began her own affair with a neighbor. When Geoffroy found out about his wife's cheating, he was genuinely shocked and angry, unable to understand how Catherine could betray their marriage. While he had been keeping perfect spiritual faithfulness to his courtly love ideal, the mental conflict was so complete that Geoffroy never saw the connection between his own emotional abandonment of his wife and her decision to seek affection somewhere else. Geoffroy's story was repeated countless times across medieval Europe as the courtly love tradition created generations of men who believed that the highest form of love was unattainable longing for unavailable women, while treating their real wives like partners in a business. The romantic idea of faraway figures, combined with the low value placed on relationships right in front of them, created a culture where real closeness became almost impossible. The money-related problems of courtly love were as bad as the emotional ones. Knights would spend huge amounts of money on fancy gestures meant to impress the objects of their courtly love. They would pay for poems, fund tournaments, buy expensive gifts, and put on fancy romantic shows. At the same time, their actual families often struggled with money because the household funds were being used to support romantic fantasies that would never turn into real relationships. Sir Raoul d'Acy spent over 20,000 livres, enough to buy a large piece of land, wing the wife of the Duke of Burgundy through courtly love rituals. He paid for a series of songs that needed 12 musicians, funded a tournament that lasted 3 days, and paid for a set of tapestries showing scenes from their spiritual romance. His wife, in the meantime, was forced to sell her jewelry to pay for household bills because Raoul had made the family broke while chasing his courtly love dream. The most sneaky part of courtly love was how it created impossible standards that made people feel bad about their real relationships. The poetry described love as a life-changing experience that took lovers to higher spiritual places and made them better people through the power of pure emotion. Real relationships with their everyday worries about money, children, and daily life naturally seemed disappointing in comparison. Medieval people began to believe that if their marriages weren't giving them the amazing spiritual experiences described in courtly books, something must be wrong with them personally. They didn't realize that the literary ideals were pure fantasy. They thought that other people were having these perfect romances while they were stuck with lesser relationships. This created widespread unhappiness with marriages that might have been perfectly fine if people hadn't been judging them against impossible literary standards. The psychological tricks built into courtly love literature were clever and planned. The poems and stories always showed suffering as proof of true love, making people believe that happy relationships must be shallow or fake. They praised unrequited love as morally better than mutual love, teaching people that wanting someone who didn't want them back was more spiritually pure than enjoying love that was returned. They created a romantic ranking where the most impossible relationships were seen as the most valuable. This psychological way of thinking lasted long after the medieval period and continues to affect modern romantic expectations. The idea that True love should be easy and amazing. That passion is more important than compatibility. And that relationships need constant high drama to be meaningful. All of these ideas trace their beginnings back to medieval courtly love literature that was never meant to describe reality. The most revealing document about the gap between courtly love ideals and medieval reality is Eleanor of Aquitaine's own letters to her daughter, Marie de Champagne, written around 1180. In these private letters, Eleanor shows her frustration with the courtly love tradition she had helped create, admitting that the romantic ideals pushed in her court were causing real harm to actual marriages and relationships. Eleanor wrote, "We have created a monster of the imagination that eats up real affection. Our poets sing of love that cannot be touched, while husbands and wives grow cold to each other's touch. We've made suffering into a good thing and happiness into a failure. And I fear we have forgotten how to be simply, truly fond of another human being." Her letter shows a woman who had come to understand that the fancy romantic fantasies she had supported were actually stopping people from developing the kinds of practical, loving partnerships that could provide real happiness and stability. But by then, the courtly love tradition had become so much a part of European culture that it was impossible to change. The decline of courtly love came not from intellectual criticism, but from social chaos. The Black Death of the 14th century killed so many people that practical worries about survival, having children, and rebuilding the economy became more important than abstract romantic ideals. When half the population was dead, and the other half was struggling to rebuild civilization, the luxury of impossible romantic longing seemed silly and self-centered. But the damage had been done. Courtly love had set up romantic patterns that would last for centuries. The idealization of partners you can't have, the belief that suffering was proof of true love, the separation of spiritual and physical closeness, and the assumption that marriage and romance were fundamentally not compatible. These ideas shaped European attitudes toward love and relationships in ways that are still visible in modern culture. Coming up next, we're diving into the darkest areas of medieval sexual control, the taboos that carried death sentences, and the way accusations of sexual deviancy became weapons of political destruction. We'll meet people whose private lives became public scandals, discover how charges of sodomy and bestiality were used to get rid of inconvenient enemies, and explore the witch trials that turned sexual paranoia into mass hysteria that consumed entire communities and showed just how far societies would go to control human sexuality through terror. The flames crackled higher as Jacques de Malle, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was slowly burned alive in Paris on March 18, 1314. His crime, according to King Philip IV of France, wasn't just heresy or treason. It was the sexual act of sodomy, supposedly practiced as part of secret Templar initiation rituals. But everyone in the crowd watching Jacques burn knew the real truth. This wasn't about sexual deviancy at all. This was about getting rid of a powerful organization whose wealth and independence threatened the French king. And accusations of forbidden sexuality had become the perfect weapon for destroying inconvenient enemies. Medieval Europe had created a ranking of sexual no-nos that carried the ultimate penalty: death by fire, hanging, or worse. But these laws weren't really about protecting moral purity or stopping sexual crimes. They were about creating weapons of mass destruction that could be used against anyone who is a political, economic, or social threat. The mere accusation of sodomy, bestiality, or later, witchcraft could destroy entire families, get rid of political rivals, and justify the taking of huge fortunes, all disguised as enforcing morality. The Templar trials show how sexual accusations worked as political weapons in medieval society. King Philip IV needed to get rid of the Templars because they had become too wealthy and powerful. They were basically a state within a state, with their own army, financial network, and diplomatic ties. But attacking them directly would have been politically risky, since the Templars were officially protected by the Pope and respected by the public as holy warriors who had fought in the Crusades. Sexual deviancy charges provided the perfect solution. Philip's agents made up detailed testimonies claiming that Templar initiation ceremonies involved kissing other men on the mouth, genitals, and buttocks, engaging in mutual masturbation, and practicing sodomy as a form of brotherhood bonding. These accusations were so shocking that they immediately destroyed public support for the Templars and gave Philip a reason for seizing all their property and arresting their leaders. The testimony against the Templars was gotten through torture, so severe that many knights died before they could confess to the made-up charges. Those who survived were forced to give more and more elaborate details about sexual practices that almost certainly never happened. The interrogation records kept in the Vatican's secret archives show investigators demanding specific descriptions of sexual positions, forcing confessions about how often various acts happened, and requiring detailed testimony about who took part in what they called abominable ceremonies. The genius of using sexual accusations as political weapons was that they were almost impossible to prove wrong and created immediate social isolation for the accused. In medieval society, even being suspected of sexual deviancy was enough to destroy someone's reputation forever. Unlike charges of theft or violence, which needed evidence and witnesses, sexual accusations relied on the assumption that such behavior was so shameful that only guilty people would be accused of it. The case of Bishop Walter Langton shows how sexual accusations worked in high-level political fights. Langton was treasurer to King Edward I of England and had gained enormous power and wealth through his financial management of the royal treasury. When Edward II became king in 1307, he wanted to appoint his own favorites to positions of power, but Langton's skill and connections made him hard to remove through normal political ways. The solution was a sexual scandal. Edward II's agents spread rumors that Bishop Langton had been seen in compromising situations with young male clerks, had kept a secret male lover, and had used church funds to support his supposed illegal relationships. The accusations were never proven, but they were enough to destroy Langton's reputation and force him to resign. Edward II was then free to appoint his allies to the treasury position, reaching his political goal through sexual character assassination. The most sneaky part of medieval sexual taboos was how they created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia that made normal relationships dangerous. Men became afraid to show affection to other men, even in the context of real friendships or mentoring relationships, because such displays could be seen as evidence of sodomy. Teachers hesitated to work closely with students, priests avoided private counseling sessions, and even family relationships became tense as people worried about how their actions might be seen by hostile onlookers. The legal rules for prosecuting sexual taboos were deliberately unclear and subjective, making it easy to find evidence of guilt in almost any situation. The crime of sodomy, for example, was defined so broadly that it could include any sexual activity that didn't directly lead to having children. This meant that even married couples could, in theory, be prosecuted for sodomy if they engaged in foreplay, used any position other than missionary, or showed too much excitement for physical closeness. Bestiality accusations were often used against rural people as a way of justifying taking their land or getting rid of inconvenient peasant communities. Since rural people worked closely with animals and often lived in close quarters with livestock, it was easy to find suspicious situations that could be seen as evidence of sexual contact with animals. The accused would be tortured until they confessed, their property would be taken to pay for their prosecution, and their families would be driven from their homes. One particularly well-documented case happened in the French village of Montaillou in 1320, where Inquisition records show that accusations of bestiality were used to break up a community that had been resisting church taxes. The inquisitors claimed that the village's shepherds were having sexual relationships with their sheep, using as evidence the fact that the men spent long periods alone with their flocks in remote pastures. Under torture, several villagers confessed to detailed sexual acts with animals, providing the reason needed to take the village's land and scatter its people. The witch trials of the late medieval period represent the ultimate evolution of sexual accusations as tools of social control. Witchcraft was fundamentally defined as a sexual crime. Supposed witches were accused of having sexual relationships with demons, taking part in orgies during Sabbath meetings, and using sexual magic to corrupt their communities. These accusations allowed authorities to target anyone who didn't fit social expectations, particularly women who were too independent, too knowledgeable, or too outspoken. The sexual part of witchcraft accusations was key because it automatically discredited anything the accused. Woman might say in her own defense, she was supposedly having sex with demons. Her testimony couldn't be trusted because she was obviously under supernatural influence. If she denied the charges, that was evidence that demons were stopping her from telling the truth. If she confessed, that proved her guilt. The sexual framework made witchcraft accusations completely impossible to prove false. Marguerite Porret's trial in 1310 shows how sexual accusations could be used to get rid of intellectual and religious disagreement. Marguerite was a French mystic who had written a theological book called The Mirror of Simple Souls that challenged certain church teachings about the nature of divine love. When church authorities wanted to stop her teachings, they couldn't attack her ideas directly without getting into complex theological debates that might attract supporters. Instead, they accused Marguerite of promoting what they called spiritual adultery, the idea that her mystical experiences involved improper intimate relationships with divine figures. The inquisitors claimed that her descriptions of spiritual union with God were actually descriptions of sexual fantasies, and that her theological writings were elaborate justifications for sexual freedom. These accusations allowed them to burn Marguerite as a heretic without having to address the intellectual content of her work. The economic reason behind sexual taboo prosecutions becomes clear when looking at the property seizures that came with these cases. Convicted sodomites, bestialists, and witches automatically lost all their possessions to the king or church, creating powerful financial reasons for bringing these charges. In many regions, local authorities received a percentage of seized property, making sexual deviancy accusations a profitable form of law enforcement. The records of the Inquisition in Languedoc show that property seizures from sexual deviancy cases provided significant funding for church operations throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. Wealthy merchants, landowners, and even minor nobles found themselves targets of sexual accusations that seemed to match suspiciously with their economic success rather than their actual behavior. The psychological effect of living under constant threat of sexual accusations was devastating for medieval communities. People learned to suppress not just forbidden sexual behaviors, but any emotional expressions or personal relationships that might be misinterpreted as evidence of deviance. The result was a culture of emotional isolation and distrust, where real human connections became dangerous luxuries that few could afford. Perhaps the most tragic part of medieval sexual taboos was how they destroyed the lives of people who were already on the fringes or vulnerable. Foreigners, religious minorities, the mentally ill, and anyone who didn't fit into narrow social categories became easy targets for sexual accusations, because they lacked the social connections and political protection needed to defend themselves effectively. The case of Samuel of York illustrates this situation. Samuel was a moneylender who had become wealthy through his financial services to local Christians. When economic conditions got worse in 1190 and his Christian debtors wanted to avoid repaying their loans, they accused Samuel of corrupting Christian children through unnatural sexual acts. The accusations were completely made up, but they provided a reason for a pogrom that killed Samuel and dozens of other Jews while canceling large debts owed to the Jewish community. The selective enforcement of sexual taboos showed how these laws worked as tools of social control rather than moral protection. Powerful nobles and clergy could engage in behaviors that would result in death sentences for common people because their political connections protected them from prosecution. Meanwhile, anyone who lacked power or protection could be destroyed by the same accusations, regardless of their actual innocence or guilt. Coming up next, we're exploring how the Black Death didn't just kill half of Europe's population. It completely changed medieval sexuality by breaking down the social controls that had governed intimate relationships for centuries. We'll discover how mass death created new sexual freedoms. Meet couples who formed relationships that would have been impossible before the plague. Explore how the desperate need to repopulate Europe led to sexual practices and social changes that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and the modern world's approach to love and relationships. Silence filled the cathedral in Avignon as Pope Clement VI read the most shocking papal order in medieval history to an audience of Paris. Barely 50 survivors in what had once been a congregation of thousands. The date was September 15, 1348, and the Black Death had killed so many people that the Pope was officially suspending most church marriage rules, allowing priests to perform wedding ceremonies without public announcements, permitting marriages between distant relatives, and, most remarkably, authorizing emergency marriages for couples who simply lived together without a formal ceremony. The plague hadn't just killed half of Europe's population. It had shattered the entire social structure that controlled medieval sexuality. When death was literally at every door, the elaborate systems of sexual control that had governed medieval life for centuries suddenly seemed ridiculously unimportant. Why worry about church marriage calendars when there might not be a tomorrow? Why keep complex inheritance laws when entire family lines were being wiped out in weeks? Why save virginity for a marriage that might never happen when life expectancy had dropped to less than 30 years? The Black Death created a sexual revolution that was born not from an ideology of freedom, but from the simple realization that survival had become more important than social rules. The population catastrophe was so complete that it forced a complete rethinking of sexual and social relationships. In some regions, the population dropped by 80%, leaving villages completely empty and cities with only skeleton populations. The survivors faced a world where normal social structures had completely collapsed. There weren't enough priests to perform marriages, enough witnesses to confirm contracts, or enough family members to enforce traditional courtship rituals. People had to create new ways of forming relationships that could work in the ruins of medieval civilization. Marguerite Le Tisserand's story shows how quickly sexual norms changed during the plague years. Before 1348, Marguerite had been a respectable weaver in Rouen, unmarried at age 24. Because her family couldn't afford a proper dowry, and she refused to accept the farming marriage her parents had arranged. When the plague reached Rouen in the summer of 1348, it killed her parents, her 3 brothers, and most of her extended family within 6 weeks. Marguerite found herself completely alone with a house, a weaving business, and no social duties to anyone. For the first time in her life, Marguerite was free to make her own choices about relationships and sexuality. Her letters to her cousin in Paris, found in the archives of Notre Dame, show a woman who was both terrified and thrilled by her new freedom. She wrote, "I am 24 years old, and for the first time in my life, no one has the right to tell me whom I may love or how I may live. It is frightening beyond words, but also wonderful beyond description." Marguerite's first post-plague relationship would have been scandalous before the Black Death. She began living with Jean Lemoynier, carpenter who was significantly below her social status and had been previously married to a woman who died of the plague. Under normal medieval circumstances, such a relationship would have been impossible. The class difference would have prevented any formal marriage while living together without marriage, would have resulted in being kicked out of the church and shunned by society. But in 1349, there simply weren't enough people left alive to enforce traditional social boundaries. The local priest, himself a plague survivor who had lost most of his congregation, was more concerned with keeping some kind of Christian community together than with enforcing complex marriage rules. He performed what he called an emergency blessing for Marguerite and Jean's relationship, creating a new form of quasi-marriage that acknowledged the reality of their situation without requiring them to follow pre-plague church law. This pattern was repeated across Europe as communities developed new forms of relationship recognition that prioritized practical survival over traditional properness. Church records from the post-plague period show a huge increase in what clergy called necessity marriages, unions that would have been forbidden before the plague, but were now blessed by priests who recognized that repopulation was more important than religious rules. The economic change caused by mass death created new opportunities for sexual and social freedom, particularly for women. With so many men dead, women inherited property on a scale never seen before and found themselves in positions of economic independence that had been almost impossible before the plague. These newly wealthy widows and heiresses had choices about marriage and sexuality that their mothers never could have imagined. Lady Catherine de Beaumont's case shows how dramatically women's options changed after the plague. Catherine inherited large estates in Normandy when the plague killed her husband, her father-in-law, her brother-in-law, and her husband's 3 male cousins in the space of 2 months. At age 28, she found herself one of the wealthiest landowners in the region, with no male relatives to control her decisions and no social pressure to remarry quickly for economic security. Catherine chose to remain unmarried for 7 years, during which time she had relationships with several different men without facing the social consequences that would have destroyed her before the plague. Her account books show payments to lovers who were essentially kept men musicians, artists and scholars who provided companionship and intellectual stimulation in exchange for financial support. This arrangement would have been unthinkable before the Black Death, but in the post-plague world. Catherine's wealth and independence gave her the power to create relationships on her own terms. The Church's response to these changing sexual norms was remarkably practical. Faced with the reality that traditional marriage and sexuality rules were preventing repopulation efforts, church authorities began to interpret church law in ways that would have been heretical before the plague. Priests were instructed to prioritize keeping couples together over enforcing complex marriage regulations. Celibacy requirements for clergy were quietly relaxed in regions where priest shortages threatened to leave communities without religious services. Pope Clement VI's secret instructions to bishops in 1349, found in the Vatican's secret archives in 1983, show the extent of the Church's practical adjustments to post-plague sexuality. Bishops were authorized to perform marriages without the normal waiting periods, to bless relationships that didn't meet traditional requirements, and to overlook sexual arrangements that would have required excommunication before the plague. The document clearly states that the preservation of Christian community through population recovery takes precedence over the enforcement of particular moral regulations. The most dramatic change in post-plague sexuality was the emergence of what historians call companionate marriage, relationships based on mutual affection and compatibility, rather than purely economic or political reasons. With traditional family networks destroyed and inheritance patterns disrupted, couples began choosing partners based on personal preference rather than family strategy. This was the beginning of the modern concept of romantic love as a basis for marriage. Thomas and Alice Carpenter's marriage contract from 1352 represents this new approach to relationships. Unlike pre-plague marriage contracts that focused entirely on property transfers and family duties, Thomas and Alice's agreement includes sections for mutual emotional support, shared decision-making about household management, and even a clause allowing either party to end the marriage if they became incompatible. This kind of equal relationship structure would have been unimaginable before the social disruption caused by mass death. The population crisis also created new acceptance for relationships that had been severely pushed to the margins before the plague. With traditional family structures destroyed, people formed household arrangements that included adopted children, elderly relatives with no blood connection, and romantic partnerships that didn't fit conventional categories. Same-sex couples found it easier to live together openly because the desperate need for stable households made communities less concerned about the sexual arrangements within those households. The Brotherhood of San Giovanni in Florence provides an example of how post-plague social flexibility created space for relationships that had been heavily persecuted before the Black Death. This organization, which appeared in 1350, was officially a religious group for mutual aid among plague survivors. In practice, it worked as a support network for men who were living in romantic partnerships with other men. Church records show that the Brotherhood received an official blessing from local clergy who were more concerned with providing community stability than with investigating the private relationships of the members. The labor shortage caused by plague deaths gave working class people unheard of power in negotiating their working and living conditions, including their sexual relationships. Peasants who had been tied to the land through feudal duties found themselves free to move, to choose their employers, and to negotiate terms that included protections for their family relationships. For the first time in medieval history, ordinary people had some power to shape their own intimate lives. The records of the English manner of riddle show how this worked in practice. Before the plague, peasant marriages required the Lord's permission and often involved large fees. After 1349, with 3/4 of the population dead and desperate labor shortages, the surviving peasants could demand marriage rights as part of their employment contracts. The manor records show agreements that guarantee workers the right to marry without interference, to choose their own partners, and to maintain their households without feudal duties affecting their family relationships. Perhaps the most significant long-term change was how the Black Death broke the psychological grip that traditional sexual controls had maintained over medieval people. When faced with mass death and social collapse, people found that many of the sexual rules they had accepted as divine law were actually human constructions that could be changed when circumstances required it. This realization created a doubt about sexual authority that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation and the development of more individualistic approaches to morality. The rise of vernacular love poetry during the post-plague period reflects this new psychological freedom. Unlike the elaborate courtly love tradition that had dominated pre-plague literature, post-plague poetry focused on achievable relationships between real people who could actually be together. The poems described sexual pleasure without shame, celebrated mutual affection between partners of equal status, and saw love as a source of happiness rather than suffering. The biological need to repopulate also led to dramatic changes in attitudes towards sexuality itself. Church authorities who had spent centuries teaching that sexual pleasure was inherently sinful suddenly found themselves encouraging couples to embrace physical intimacy as a religious duty. Pregnancy and childbirth, which had been seen as dangerous punishments for sexual sin, were reframed as holy acts of rebuilding God's devastated creation. Medical texts from the post-plague period show doctors developing new approaches to sexual health that prioritized fertility and pleasure rather than moral purity. These texts included clear instructions for maximizing conception chances, advice about sexual positions and timing, and even discussions of female sexual satisfaction as important for reproductive success. The contrast with pre-plague medical literature, which had focused on suppressing sexual desire, represents a complete reversal in how medieval society understood the relationship between sexuality and health. Our final chapter brings us full circle to examine how these medieval sexual practices and the changes caused by the Black Death created the foundation for modern attitudes toward love, sexuality, and relationships. We'll discover which medieval sexual taboos still influence American politics today, explore how religious sexual control evolved from medieval confession booths to modern purity culture, and reveal the surprising ways that the medieval sexual revolution created both the freedoms and the anxieties that define contemporary intimate relationships. The connections between medieval bedrooms and modern dating apps will astonish you. Tonight, as millions of Americans swipe through dating apps, many don't realize they're participating in a sexual revolution that began over 900 years ago in the plague-torn villages of medieval Europe. The connections between medieval sexuality and modern American culture run so deep that understanding medieval bedroom politics helps explain everything from current debates about birth control to the psychological anxieties that drive modern relationship apps. The medieval sexual legacy isn't ancient history. It's the invisible foundation that still shapes how we love, marry, and regulate intimate relationships in the 21st century. Consider the current American political battles over reproductive rights. The arguments being made in 2025 about contraception, abortion, and sexual education are direct descendants of medieval church policies that treated women's reproductive ability as property belonging to male guardians. When modern politicians argue that women shouldn't have full control over their reproductive choices, they're echoing legal principles that trace back to medieval laws that valued women's bodies mainly for their economic use to men. The language itself shows these connections. The term purity culture that is common in contemporary American religious discussions about sexuality comes directly from medieval ideas about sexual cleanliness that were used to control women's behavior and economic value. Modern purity rings, abstinence pledges, and virginity testing practices are essentially updated versions of medieval virginity checking rituals that treated women's sexual status as family property, requiring protection and monitoring. Perhaps the most striking continuation between medieval and modern sexuality is how religious institutions continue to work as sexual surveillance systems. Contemporary evangelical churches that require detailed accountability about members, sexual behavior that separates young people by gender to prevent temptation, and that makes sexual conformity a condition of community membership are operating according to principles that were perfected in medieval confession booths and church courts. The psychological patterns set up by medieval sexual control continue to shape modern American attitudes toward pleasure, shame, and relationships. The medieval teaching that sexual pleasure was inherently bad and should be strictly regulated for having children created guilt patterns that continue in contemporary purity culture. Many Americans still struggle with the medieval legacy that saw sexual enjoyment as morally questionable, even within marriage. Modern dating culture shows fascinating parallels to medieval courtly love traditions. The current obsession with romantic partners who are out of one's league, the belief that love should involve suffering and uncertainty, and the tendency to idealize distant or unavailable partners all trace back to medieval literature that taught people to value impossible relationships over achievable ones. Dating apps use these medieval romantic patterns by creating artificial scarcity and encouraging users to pursue idealized profiles rather than developing real relationships with accessible partners. The medieval invention of romantic love as a form of entertainment for bored nobles has evolved into a massive modern industry that profits from keeping people unhappy with real relationships. Contemporary romance novels, romantic comedies, and social media relationship content create the same impossible standards that medieval troubadour poetry established, teaching people that ordinary affection and compatibility are somehow less than dramatic passion and constant emotional intensity. Economic patterns from medieval marriage markets continue in modern American relationship culture in ways that would surprise most people. The current practice of expensive engagement rings, elaborate wedding ceremonies that can cost more than houses, and the assumption that romantic gestures should involve large spending all come from medieval traditions that treated love as a luxury item that showed wealth and status. The medieval pattern of using sexual accusations as political weapons has evolved into modern American cancel culture and sexual harassment allegations in political contexts. While real sexual misconduct should absolutely be addressed, the medieval playbook of destroying political enemies through sexual scandal continues to influence how these accusations are used and received in contemporary American politics. Modern American approaches to sexual education and adolescent development still reflect medieval anxieties about young people's sexuality. The assumption that teenagers are inherently dangerous and need constant supervision, that's sexual education, should focus on fear rather than information, and that young people can't be trusted to make informed decisions about their own bodies all come from medieval beliefs about the corrupting nature of sexual knowledge. The most profound legacy of medieval sexuality is psychological, the belief that intimate relationships should be sources of shame, surveillance, and social control rather than personal fulfillment and mutual support. This mindset created patterns of sexual anxiety, performance pressure, and relationship dysfunction that continue to influence how Americans approach love and intimacy centuries later. But there's hope in understanding this history. The same medieval period that created oppressive sexual control systems has also produced moments of real freedom and human connection that point towards healthier possibilities. The post-plague sexual revolution showed that seemingly permanent social structures could change quickly when people realized that survival and happiness mattered more than artificial rules. Contemporary Americans who feel trapped by religious sexual expectations, by family pressure about relationships, or by cultural messages that make sexuality shameful, can find inspiration in medieval people who found ways to create real love and authentic relationships despite living under far more oppressive systems than anything we face today. Agnes and William, who found emotional intimacy despite church surveillance. Eleanor and Geoffrey, who created affection from trauma. The bathhouse patrons who discovered that pleasure didn't require shame. The plague survivors who rebuilt society around mutual care rather than social control. The medieval sexual legacy also shows that many of the relationship problems we think of as modern actually have ancient roots that can be addressed through understanding and intentional change. The anxiety about sexual performance, the pressure to conform to impossible romantic ideals, the tendency to treat intimate partners as property or status symbols, these aren't unavoidable human traits, but learned patterns that can be unlearned perhaps. Most importantly, studying medieval sexuality shows that the systems that control and regulate intimate relationships are always political, always serve specific economic and social interests, and always can be challenged and changed by people who decide that human happiness matters more than institutional power. The medieval Catholic Church seemed permanently dominant until the Black Death and social changes made its sexual control system suddenly seem irrelevant and oppressive. Modern Americans facing pressure from religious institutions, political movements, or cultural expectations about how they should conduct their intimate lives can take encouragement from knowing that sexual liberation movements aren't new or unheard of. People have been fighting for the right to love authentically, to enjoy physical pleasure without shame, and to form relationships based on mutual care rather than social control for over 1,000 years. The story of medieval sexuality is ultimately a story about human resilience, about ordinary people who found ways to love, to find joy, and to create meaningful connections with each other despite living under systems designed to make such connections difficult or impossible. Their creativity, courage, and refusal to let institutions completely control their intimate lives created the foundations for every expansion of sexual and romantic freedom that followed. As we conclude this journey through the bizarre, shocking, and ultimately inspiring world of medieval sexuality, remember that understanding this history isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about recognizing that the struggles for sexual autonomy, genuine intimacy, and relationships based on mutual respect rather than power and control are ongoing. The medieval people whose stories we've shared tonight were fighting the same battles for authentic love and human dignity that continue today. Their victories and defeats, their courage and creativity, and their ultimate refusal to let institutions completely define their capacity for love and connection remind us that sexual freedom isn't a modern invention. It's a human desire that has been pursued and partially achieved across centuries of seemingly impossible circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through medieval sexuality. The courage of people like Agnes de Montoire, Marguerite Lemaître, and countless unnamed individuals who refuse to let oppressive systems destroy their capacity for love and joy provides inspiration for anyone facing similar challenges today. Their stories remind us that human sexuality at its best is about connection, pleasure, and mutual care values that no institution can permanently suppress, no matter how hard it tries. I hope these stories have given you not just entertainment, but insight into how the past continues to shape the present and inspiration for creating relationships based on genuine care rather than social control. Until our next journey into the fascinating and complex world of human history, sweet dreams.